The sound of spears clashing against marble steps echoed through the corridors of the Kremlin. In the early morning of May 15, 1682, the Streltsy stormed into the Tsar's bedchamber, their boots thudding heavily on the stone floors. Soldiers searched the halls for traitors, kicking open every door. The air was thick, with the smell of gunpowder and sweat. A 9.5 year old boy stood by the window, gazing through the stained glass at the square below. He watched as soldiers dragged two men onto the stone pavement. Screams rose from below, followed by the dull thud of metal-piercing flesh. Blood spread across the white snow, like ink. The boy's mother knelt on the floor, her hands clasped in prayer, her voice hoarse to the point of being almost inaudible. The boy remained motionless, simply staring out the window. His eyes were large, but there were no tears. This moment etched a permanent mark in his mind. For the first time, he understood. In Moscow, power is not written on paper. It is written with the tip of a blade. 5 days ago, everything seemed settled. Tsar Fyodor III had breathed his last on his sickbed, and the Council of Nobles had voted to choose a successor. The Orthodox Patriarch presided over the blessing ceremony, sprinkling holy water on the boy's forehead. By all accounts, Peter Alexeyevich was the new Tsar of Russia. But the shooting corps did not accept this outcome. These soldiers were no longer a true army. They were armed merchant groups from Moscow. A century ago, they were indeed elite, but now they run shops in the city, enjoy tax exemptions, and treat officer positions as property that can be sold to their sons. Reform would destroy this system. So they decided to forcibly overturn the decision of the Noble Council. The riot lasted for 3 days and 3 nights. The soldiers carried a list of traitors. Peter's uncle, the nobles who supported him, anyone connected to the Narishkin family. They searched room by room, dragged out the victims, and executed them on the spot in the corridors. Peter witnessed everything, not through hearsay, not by learning about it afterward, but with his own eyes. He heard the footsteps outside the corridor, the pleas and screams, the sound of weapons piercing flesh. Those sounds penetrated the thick doors and walls, burrowing into his ears, forever etched in the depths of his memory. Under the terrifying pressure, the nobles yielded. They convened an emergency meeting in a hall surrounded by the shooting corps, with the shadows of soldiers cast long on the walls outside the windows. Fear spread through the room like a plague. They created a monstrosity, a dual Tsar system. Peter and Ivan would jointly rule Russia. Ivan Alexeyevich was a tragic figure. At 15, he was nearly blind, had difficulty speaking, and was physically weak. He had no interest in power, wishing only to pray in peace. However, as the younger half-brother of the former Tsar, he held legitimate bloodline claims. Real power fell into the hands of their sister, Sophia. The craftsmen created an absurd 2-seater throne. 2 boys sat side by side, with a curtain behind them. Sophia sat behind the curtain, whispering through a small hole to tell them what to say. When foreign ambassadors came to pay their respects, they would see the 2 children mechanically reciting words that were clearly beyond their understanding. A scene both comical and sorrowful. Peter hated all of it. Every time he sat on that double throne, every time he heard Sophia's whispers behind the curtain, every time he had to share the title with the incompetent Ivan. All of it reminded him of that failure in May. It reminded him of how violence had overthrown the law, how fear had rewritten decisions. The shooting corps got what they wanted: increased wages, expanded privileges, and an official pardon for the riot. They became the unchallengeable armed force in Moscow. The Narishkin family was crushed. Peter's mother and several relatives were advised to leave Moscow and were sent to Preobrazhenskoye, a royal estate 15 kilometers away. This is a gilded cage. They have servants, food, and warm fireplaces. But there are also Sophia's spies, disguised as servants or gardeners. Every visitor is recorded. Every letter is inspected. Yet exile also brings unexpected freedom. Away from court etiquette, Peter can spend his time as he wishes. Peter had felt suffocated by court life since childhood. The Orthodox ceremonies that lasted for hours, chanted in ancient Church Slavonic, standing in unheated churches during winter, clad in heavy ceremonial robes, and the endless squabbles among the nobility over ancestry and titles. He wanted to understand how things worked, not in theory, but the actual mechanisms. In Preobrazhenskoye, these interests were free to flourish. The estate was surrounded by vast forests and meadows, with a large lake nearby. Peter began gathering young noble companions to organize mock battles. They started with wooden swords and fake spears, but his imagination soon surpassed mere play acting. He wanted real training and real weapons. He summoned foreign officers from Moscow, Germans and Scots serving in Russia. He had them teach European tactics. He acquired real muskets and cannons, small, but fully functional. The scent of sulfur from gunpowder began to fill the air. His games started to involve live ammunition and genuine tactical maneuvers. By 1685, the 13-year-old Peter was no longer playing. He was building an army, though only a few hundred strong, composed mainly of friends and volunteers. Yet this force was organized according to European standards and trained by foreign officers. He called them the Preobrazhensky and Semyonovsky regiments. These would become Russia's first truly modern armies. The court in Moscow regarded these as the boy's eccentric hobbies. Sophia's spies reported the young Tsar was playing soldier games. But this posed no threat. His army was too small. Let him play in the countryside. It kept him busy and away from real power. Yet, these games were teaching Peter crucial things: how to command, how to enforce discipline. More importantly, he was building personal loyalty. The soldiers of the Preobrazhensky and Semyonovsky regiments did not pledge allegiance to Sophia or to tradition. They were loyal to Peter himself, the young man who drilled with them, the Tsar who personally shouldered a musket and fired, the commander who fell and rose again in the mud alongside them. Then Peter discovered the foreign quarter. Outside Moscow, there was a special district called the Mute Quarter, inhabited by Europeans who did not speak Russian, German engineers, Dutch doctors, Scottish officers. The traditional Russian nobility looked down on them, viewing them as heretics and a cultural threat. But Peter was drawn to them because they knew how to build ships that could sail. He met Franz Lefort, a Swiss mercenary. Lefort did not treat Peter as a Tsar to be revered, but as a young man eager to learn. They formed a rare friendship, not as ruler and subject, but as teacher and student, and as friends. Through Lefort, Peter met Patrick Gordon, a Scottish general who taught him European military tactics. There was also Karsten Brandt, a Dutch carpenter, who taught Peter how to build ships, not in theory, but in practice. How to select timber, how to bend planks, how to seal seams. Peter's hands began to develop the calluses of a woodworker, his fingernails filled with wood shavings and tar. For a Tsar, this was unimaginable degradation, but Peter cared nothing for orthodoxy. Then he discovered a ship. In the abandoned warehouse, covered in dust, lay an old British sloop. It had features that Russian riverboats lacked, a triangular sail system that allowed sailing against the wind. Peter had Brandt repair it, then dragged the boat to Lake Plashayevo to learn navigation. He fell into the icy lake water countless times, but each time he climbed back onto the ship. This ship opened Peter's imagination to the world. Russia was a landlocked empire, trapped on land countries, with oceans, the Netherlands, England, Spain, dominated world trade and could transport armies to distant continents. Ships were not merely means of transport. They were a form of power, the key to the modern world. By 1689, Peter was 17 years old. His body had fully developed. He was exceptionally tall, standing out in any crowd. He could communicate in broken but understandable Dutch with carpenters and understand military commands in German. He knew how to operate artillery, sail a ship, and organize military drills. Yet, he still held no real power. Sophia firmly controlled the government. The Streltsy remained the dominant force in Moscow. The traditional nobility held sway over the land. Worse still, Peter's foreign friends made him a suspicious figure in the eyes of the Orthodox community. Orthodox monks spread rumors the young Tsar had been corrupted by heretics. He planned to abolish the church, and he intended to turn Russia into a foreign colony. Sophia heard these rumors and saw the threat. Peter was no longer the frightened 9-year-old boy. He was organizing armies and conspiring with foreigners. In 1689, he would turn 17, the traditional age for a Tsar to assume personal rule. The regency should have ended. But Sophia had no intention of relinquishing power. She enjoyed making decisions. Late on the night of the 7th of August, a messenger galloped into Preobrazhenskoye. He brought a warning. The Streltsy planned to arrest Peter before dawn. The truth of the message was unclear. It could have been a test by Sophia or a genuine conspiracy. But Peter decided to act as if it were real. He leaped from his bed and fled on horseback, still in his nightclothes. He rushed to the Trinity, Sergius Monastery, 60 kilometers away. This was not panic, but tactics. The monastery was one of Russia's holiest sites, with formidable fortifications. By taking refuge there, Peter positioned himself as a protector of the faith. He rode through the entire night, the sound of his horse's hooves echoing through the silent forest. At dawn, he arrived at the monastery. From here, he issued the call, "All loyal nobles and officers, come here." It was a high-stakes gamble. If not enough people responded, he would be isolated. But with sufficient support, he could challenge Sophia from the Kremlin. Sophia issued the opposite order: stay in Moscow, support the legitimate regent. Then the Patriarch made a decision. The highest leader of the Orthodox Church declared Peter had come of age, and the regency should end. Sophia's continued regency was an overreach. This declaration changed the nature of the conflict. It was no longer a rebellious Tsar against a regent, but a legitimate Tsar reclaiming usurped power. The army began to shift. First, a few units declared neutrality. Then foreign officers joined Peter. Key noble families left Moscow one after another, heading to Tresta on horseback. The wind was changing direction. Sophia felt her power slipping away. She attempted to go to the monastery in person to negotiate, but was denied entry at the gate. Peter would not see her, would not negotiate, would not compromise. She returned to Moscow in anger, but she knew she had already lost. By early September, Sophia's supporters began to betray her. As the balance of power tilted toward Peter, these individuals swiftly switched sides. Peter's first actions revealed what he had learned from 1682. He offered no forgiveness and accepted no compromise. He arrested Sophia's lover, Golitsyn, and exiled him to Siberia, where he would spend the rest of his life in that frozen wilderness. Commander Shaklovity of the Shooting Corps was subjected to even harsher treatment. He was arrested, tortured, and under duress confessed to the conspiracy. He was then publicly executed, not by swift beheading, but by being drawn and quartered, a medieval punishment designed to maximize suffering. His body was displayed for 3 days as a warning. This is the fate of those who betray the Tsar. Sophia was forcibly sent to the Novodevichy convent. She was not executed. Killing the Tsar's sister would have been too extreme. However, she was stripped of all power and imprisoned for life. She was compelled to take the veil, renouncing secular life. This was a social death, more enduring than physical demise. She would spend the remaining 15 years of her life there. Peter is 17 years old and now holds unchallenged political power. He has eliminated Sophia's faction and weakened the Streltsy. However, he has also inherited the same institutional structure. The Streltsy still control the streets of Moscow. The nobility dominate the administration. The church oversees education, and the landowners control the land. He has gained power, but he has not yet acquired the ability to transform Russia. Power and capability are two different things. He can issue orders, but who will carry them out? The entire state apparatus is designed to preserve tradition. Every vested interest will resist change. Peter knew he needed not just power, but also knowledge and tools. He needed to see how other countries operated, not from books, but with his own eyes. In 1697, he would make one of the most unusual decisions in Russian history. He would leave Russia and travel to Europe for 18 months. Not as the Tsar. That would involve cumbersome formalities. He would go as an ordinary member under the pseudonym Peter Mikhailov. He would study shipbuilding in the Netherlands and research the navy in England. This decision caused panic. The Tsar leaving the country, heading to the land of infidels. Conservatives warned that Peter would be corrupted by foreigners. But Peter didn't care. He knew that what Russia needed was not more tradition, but a complete transformation. And transformation required understanding Europe's secrets. Not just its technology, but its institutions, culture, and way of thinking. He will recruit hundreds of experts in Europe, engineers, doctors, teachers, military officers. He will purchase weapons, tools, and books. He will understand the essence of a modern state. But first, before leaving, he needs to consolidate his power. The victory in 1689 was only the first step. The real test has yet to come. The journey to Europe will provide him with the vision needed to transform Russia. Peter spent the next few years in Preobrazhenskoye, continuing to train his army, to study and to plan. He knew the true test had not yet come. The year 1689 had given him power, but not the ability to change Russia that required something deeper: knowledge, allies, a clear vision. He would find the tools for the future in the foreign quarter. He will learn how to drag Russia into modernity in a place despised by all traditional Russians. He will become a carpenter, a sailor, an engineer, whatever it takes, to understand where Europe's strength comes from. He has already seized power through violence. Now he needs to learn how to use that power to transform a nation resistant to change. After the bloodshed of 1682, Moscow fell into an eerie calm. Nominally, the 10-year-old Peter and the 16-year-old Ivan V ruled jointly, but real power lay in the hands of Peter's half, sister Sophia. At 25, she was intelligent, ambitious, and the first woman in the Romanov family to openly wield political power. By tradition, royal women were expected to remain secluded in the harem, the women's quarters of the palace, and stay out of politics. But Sophia broke with this convention, ruling Russia as regent, though never formally crowned. Her position was precarious. As a female regent, she had almost no precedent in Orthodox tradition, and her authority depended on the support of the Streltsy and the weakness of the young Tsars. Sophia knew her time was limited. According to tradition, Peter would come of age at 16, at which point the regency should end and power should be transferred to him. This gave Sophia roughly 6 years to consolidate her position and find ways to extend her authority. She adopted several strategies. First, she attempted to marginalize Peter, keeping him away from Moscow and real power. Peter and his mother were advised to move to Preobrazhenskoye, a royal estate on the outskirts of Moscow, ostensibly for their safety, but in reality to isolate them. Second, Sophia cultivated relationships with the Streltsy, granting them privileges and payments to ensure their continued loyalty. Third, she appointed her own supporters to key positions, particularly Vasily Golitsyn, who became her chief minister and rumored lover. Peter spent his formative years from age 10 to 17 in Preobrazhenskoye. This period, though a political exile, turned into an informal education that shaped his future, freed from the formal court etiquette and orthodox conservative education of the Kremlin. Peter was able to freely explore his interests. He became fascinated with military games. Not symbolic court rituals, but real tactics, weapons, and fortifications. He obtained actual weapons from the Kremlin's armory, recruited young nobles, and even serfs as playmates, and organized elaborate campaigns. These were not children's games, they were serious military training with real discipline, tactical drills, and mock battles. From these games emerged two regiments, the Preobrazhensky and Semyonovsky, initially toy armies that later became the core of the Russian Imperial Guard. But more importantly was Peter's discovery of the Foreign Quarter, a district in Moscow where foreign experts, merchants, and officers were permitted to reside. Here, Peter encountered people from Holland, England, Germany, and Scotland. Engineers, doctors, officers, and merchants. They represented a different world, that of Western Europe, where technology, science, and commerce were decades ahead of Russia. Peter, with an insatiable appetite for learning, began spending time in the Foreign Quarter, studying their languages, absorbing their knowledge, and questioning them about Europe. The most influential among them were Patrick Gordon, a Scottish officer serving in the Russian army, and Franz Lefort, a Swiss adventurer who became Peter's mentor and friend. They taught Peter military science, European etiquette, and a broader perspective on the world. Lefort, in particular, encouraged Peter's curiosity, organized gatherings, introduced him to other foreigners, and urged him to question Russian traditions. Through these individuals, Peter began to understand the extent of Russia's backwardness. European armies employed advanced firearms and tactics, while Russia still relied on outdated methods. Europe boasted thriving cities, trade networks, and scientific institutions, whereas Russia had almost none of these. This realization planted in Peter's mind the idea that Russia needed fundamental change and had to learn from the West. In 1688, Peter discovered an old British ship in a warehouse, unlike Russian flat-bottomed riverboats. This vessel was designed for sea voyages. Peter was captivated. He wanted to learn how to operate it. Foreign craftsmen helped restore it, and Peter began sailing on the Moscow River. Later on, the larger Lake Pleshaevo. This experience ignited a lifelong passion for seafaring. Peter dreamed of Russia having a navy, ports, and maritime trade. But Russia was landlocked. Its only sea access was Arkhangelsk on the Arctic coast, frozen for most of the year. To become a maritime power, Russia needed ports in warm waters, in the Baltic or Black Sea. This required seizing territory from Sweden or the Ottoman Empire. These ideas took shape in Peter's young mind and would drive his foreign policy for decades to come. Meanwhile, in Moscow, Sophia's regency faced increasing challenges. She sought to legitimize her rule through successes in foreign policy. Her most ambitious project was the campaigns against the Crimean Tatars, vassals of the Ottoman Empire, who had raided Russia's southern borders for centuries. In 1687 and 1689, Russian armies marched south under Golitsyn's command. Both campaigns failed, logistics collapsed, the troops suffered from intense heat and water shortages on the steppes, and no significant victories were achieved. These failures weakened Sophia's position, making her rule appear incompetent. At the same time, Peter was approaching adulthood. By 1689, he was 17 years old, and by tradition should have assumed personal rule. Sophia faced a choice: to peacefully relinquish power or attempt to retain it through extreme measures. She chose the latter. She began spreading rumors that Peter was unfit to rule, too young, too controlled by foreign influences, and too indifferent to Russian traditions. She insinuated that his time in the foreign quarter had corrupted him, and he was no longer a true Orthodox Tsar. She also attempted to elevate herself as a co-ruler, not merely a regent, but a legitimate empress, equal to Peter and Ivan. This was unprecedented in Russian tradition and met with strong opposition from the nobility and the church. Patriarch Wahim was particularly opposed. He declared female rule to be in violation of Orthodox principles. But Sophia persisted, relying on the support of the Streltsy to intimidate her opponents. In the summer of 1689, tensions reached a breaking point. Peter, now 17, demanded recognition as the legitimate ruler. Sophia refused to step down, claiming that both Tsars were still young and needed her guidance. Behind the scenes, both sides prepared for confrontation. Sophia secured the loyalty of the Streltsy, while Peter rallied his supporters, including his toy regiments and foreign officers. The Kremlin was filled with intrigue, informants, and secret meetings. Each side suspected the other of planning a coup or assassination. In August, the situation erupted. Reports emerged that the Streltsy intended to arrest Peter. Whether true or false, Peter took it seriously. Late on the night of the 7th of August, he fled on horseback from Preobrazhenskoye to the Troitsky Monastery, 60 kilometers away. The Trinity Monastery held immense symbolic significance, one of Russia's holiest monasteries, fortified with strong defenses. Attacking, it was akin to attacking orthodoxy itself. From the monastery, Peter dispatched messengers to every important noble, military unit, and foreign envoy in Moscow, declaring himself the legitimate Tsar and calling for their support against the traitors. This forced everyone to choose sides. Neutrality was no longer an option. One by one, key figures declared their support for Peter. The Patriarch, foreign officers like Gordon, some Streltsy regiments, and most of the major noble families. Sophia's support crumbled. She attempted to go to the monastery in person to negotiate with Peter, but was denied entry. A public humiliation. By September, she had no choice but to surrender. Sophia was forced to relinquish power and enter the Novodevichi convent, a polite form of imprisonment. She spent the rest of her life there, stripped of all political contact, effectively erased from history. Her main supporters were punished. Golitsyn was exiled to Siberia, and the Streltsy commander Shaklovity was publicly executed after being tortured. The execution was brutal, drawn and quartered, a slow and agonizing death, serving as a warning. Peter, now 17, was the unchallenged ruler of Russia. The 7-year struggle with Sophia had taught him crucial lessons. Power must be seized and maintained decisively. Moderation is seen as weakness, opposition must be ruthlessly suppressed, and Russia needed modernization to become strong. But Peter was not yet ready to rule in full. He left the daily governance to his mother Natalia and her relatives, while he continued his education, military training, studying navigation, and engaging with foreign experts. In 1689, he was also compelled to marry, traditionally arranged to Avdokia Lopukina, a member of a conservative noble family. It was a disastrous match. Avdokia was traditional, devout, and had no interest in European culture or Peter's pursuits. The marriage was never happy, and in 1698, Peter would send her to a convent. For now, however, the marriage satisfied tradition, producing an heir, Alexei, though the father-son relationship would be tragically strained. In the early 1690s, Peter focused on military modernization. He expanded his toy regiments into real military units, training them according to European standards. He established artillery factories to produce modern cannons. He recruited officers from Europe to train Russian soldiers. From 1695 to 1696, He launched campaigns against Azov, an Ottoman fortress on the Don River, controlling access to the Black Sea. The first campaign, 1695, failed. The Russian army was unable to effectively besiege the fortress and lacked naval power to prevent Ottoman resupply by sea. But Peter learned from the failure. In the winter of 1696, he built a fleet in Voronezh, dozens of sailing ships and galleys. This was an extraordinary achievement, constructing a navy in an inland city within months. In the spring of 1696, Peter returned to Azov with his new fleet. This time, the Russian navy blockaded the fortress, cutting off Ottoman supplies, while the army besieged it from land. After 3 months, Azov surrendered, Peter's first major military victory. It proved the value of modern tactics and technology, but Azov was only the beginning. Peter dreamed of a larger navy, greater conquests, and Russia's rise as a major power. To achieve this, he needed more knowledge about shipbuilding, military science, and European institutions and culture. He needed to visit Europe himself to see how advanced societies operated, recruit experts, and forge alliances. In 1697, he made an extraordinary decision. He would leave Russia on an embassy tour, traveling through Europe as both a student and a diplomat. No Russian Tsar had ever done such a thing, leaving the country for over a year, visiting foreign courts, and working like an ordinary apprentice. Peter's years in Preobrazhenskoye were not only a period of military training, but also a time of character formation. Away from the stifling etiquette and conservative atmosphere of the Kremlin, he developed a love for practical knowledge and physical labor. He was not content with theoretical learning. He wanted to handle tools with his own hands, build things, and understand how machinery worked. He studied carpentry, metalworking, printing, and even dental surgery. This emphasis on practical skills was unprecedented among the Russian nobility, who typically viewed manual labor as inferior. But Peter believed that a ruler should understand every aspect of what he governed, from abstract policies to concrete implementation. This hands-on approach would become a hallmark of his reform methods. He did not merely order changes, he often demonstrated how to carry them out himself. During this period, Peter also developed a deep distrust of traditional Russian culture and orthodox conservatism. The modernity he witnessed in the foreign quarter, science, technology, rational inquiry, stood in stark contrast to the world of the Kremlin, where tradition, superstition, and religious orthodoxy reigned supreme. The Russian Church opposed innovation, viewing science as heresy and clinging to ancient ways of doing things. The Russian nobility was steeped in hereditary privilege and disdain for practical knowledge. Peter began to see this conservatism as the root cause of Russia's backwardness. His conclusion was radical. What Russia needed was not gradual reform, but a cultural revolution, breaking the shackles of tradition and forcibly adopting European ways, no matter the resistance. This conviction would drive his most controversial policies later on, enforcing beard, shaving, European clothing, secularizing the church, and dismantling traditional social structures. During Sophia's regency, she did attempt some reforms, but these were cautious and limited. She signed the Eternal Peace Treaty with Poland in 1686, ending decades of conflict and aligning Russia with the anti-Ottoman Holy League. She encouraged some cultural development, establishing the Slavic Greek Latin Academy, Russia's first institution of higher education. She sought to make the legal system more orderly and consistent. However, none of these reforms were fundamental. They operated within the existing structure, without challenging traditional authority or cultural norms. Sophia's approach was gradualist, cautious, and respectful of vested interests. This contrasts with Peter's later methods, which would be radical, coercive, and willing to crush any obstacles. Ironically, had Sophia succeeded in maintaining power, Russia might have experienced a gentler, less violent, but also slower and potentially less thorough modernization. The power struggle of 1689 also revealed the problematic nature of the streltsy. These units, originally created in the 16th century as a standing army, had by the late 17th century become vested interest groups. More than military forces, they enjoyed privileges, exemption from taxes, trade monopolies, permanent residence in Moscow. Many streltsy were more merchants or artisans than soldiers, viewing military service as a means to retain privileges rather than a profession. They were politically active, intervening in succession crises, supporting or opposing different factions. They represented the old Russia, traditional, privileged, resistant to change. Peter saw them as obstacles to modernization, but in 1689 he was not yet strong enough to challenge them. That would come in 1698, when a streltsy rebellion gave Peter the pretext to destroy them permanently. Peter's years in Preobrazhenskoye also witnessed the formation of his character, both its strengths and serious flaws. On the positive side, he developed extraordinary energy, curiosity, and a capacity for learning. He could quickly grasp complex technical concepts, work tirelessly for long hours, and inspire those around him through personal example. He was relatively indifferent to social hierarchy, willing to associate with common soldiers, craftsmen, or foreign civilians if they possessed useful knowledge. This meritocratic approach would enable him to promote talented individuals regardless of their origins. However, he also developed troubling traits: a volatile temper, impatience with opposition, cruelty toward those he perceived as obstructing progress, and a lack of empathy or concern for individual suffering. He could order large-scale violence or accept the deaths of thousands if he believed it served a greater purpose. This ruthlessness would make his reforms possible, but also render them terribly costly. After 1689, although Peter nominally held power, his mother Natalia and her family managed the government in practice until her death in 1694. This arrangement suited Peter well. He had little interest in day-to-day administration, preferring to focus on his military and technical projects. However, Natalia's death forced him to become more directly involved in governance. He found the Russian state apparatus inefficient, corrupt, and resistant to change. The Boyar Council, the advisory body of the great nobles, was slow, conservative, and more concerned with protecting the privileges of its members than with effective governance. The various departments, prikazy, had overlapping jurisdictions and were managed by hereditarily appointed officials rather than competent professionals. Tax collection was chaotic and insufficient. The army, though large, was poorly trained, equipped with outdated weapons, and commanded by noble amateurs lacking knowledge of modern warfare. Peter realized that superficial reforms were insufficient. Systemic restructuring was needed, which would require breaking entrenched interests and traditions. By 1696, following the victory at Azov, Peter had reached a crucial conclusion. Russia's fundamental problem was isolation. Cut off from Europe, it could not access the knowledge, technology, and ideas driving European progress. This isolation was not only geographical, lacking warm water ports, but also cultural and psychological. The Russian elite were suspicious of foreign influences. The Orthodox Church viewed Western Christianity as heretical, and traditionalists saw anything European as a threat to Russian identity. Breaking this isolation required a multifaceted approach, securing maritime access, establishing diplomatic relations with European nations, importing foreign experts, sending Russians abroad to study, and, most fundamentally, shifting the attitudes of the Russian elite to open them to European culture and knowledge. This ambitious plan would take decades to implement, encounter fierce resistance, and demand that Peter employ every tool at his disposal: persuasion, incentives, coercion, and violence. Late on the night of the 7th of August, 1689, the Preobrazhenskoye estate was shrouded in an uneasy silence. Peter tossed and turned in bed. Over the past few weeks, the news from Moscow had grown increasingly unsettling. Sophia was consolidating her control over the Streltsy, and her supporters were spreading rumors that Peter was planning a coup. Tensions were stretched taut like a bowstring, ready to snap at any moment. Around midnight, a messenger galloped into the estate, his horse's nostrils flaring with white breath, its coat slick with sweat. The message he brought was brief and deadly. The Streltsy planned to arrest Peter before dawn, possibly even execute his key supporters. The source of the information was unclear. It could have been a sympathizer at court, a spy planted by Peter, or even a false rumor deliberately spread by Sophia to test Peter's reaction. Peter's reaction was instinctive and decisive. He did not call his advisors to discuss the veracity of the news, did not send anyone to Moscow to verify, and did not attempt to resolve the matter through diplomatic means. He leapt straight from his bed, not even bothering to dress formally. Merely throwing on a robe, he rushed to the stables and personally saddled the fastest horse. His mother and servants, awakened by the sudden commotion, hurried to see what was happening. Natalia pleaded with him to wait until dawn, or at least to take a proper escort. But Peter refused. Every minute of delay could be fatal. If the Streltsy were truly on the move, they might already be on their way. His only chance was to flee immediately, to escape to a place they would not dare attack. Within minutes, Peter rode out of the estate and vanished into the night. The destination was the Trinity, Sergius Monastery, 60 kilometers away. This was not a random choice. Peter and his advisors had long discussed where to go in the event of a crisis. The Trinity Monastery offered several key advantages. First, it had strong fortifications, tall stone walls, and multiple towers capable of withstanding a siege. Second, it held immense symbolic significance. It was one of Russia's holiest monasteries, housing the relics of Saint Sergius of Redonezh. Attacking this monastery would mean attacking the Orthodox faith itself. Third, it was far enough from Moscow to give Peter time to rally supporters, yet not so distant that he would appear to be fleeing Russia. Peter rode through the darkness, unsure if pursuers were behind him. The night forest was filled with sounds: the hoot of owls, the snap of branches, the distant howl of wolves. At dawn, Peter arrived at the monastery. He nearly fell from his horse, utterly exhausted and still dressed in his nightshirt and robe. The monks were stunned by this unusual visitor. Though Peter had used a false name to conceal his identity, his height and youthful face gave him away. The abbot immediately offered sanctuary, not only out of religious duty but also political calculation. If Peter won, the abbot would be rewarded for supporting him. If Peter lost, the abbot could claim he had merely extended traditional sanctuary. Peter was settled into a humble but secure room, where he could finally rest for a few hours. Yet his mind raced on. Escape was only the first step. Now, he needed to turn this crisis into an opportunity. Peter's first action was to send messengers, not in secret, but as an open proclamation. He dispatched them to every prominent noble family in Moscow, to every military unit stationed around the capital, and even to foreign envoys. The message was simple yet powerful. The legitimate Tsar, Peter Alexeyevich, was at the Trinity Monastery, summoning all loyal subjects to protect him from the plots of traitors. He did not name Sophia specifically. Not yet, but the implication was clear. These messengers also carried more specific promises. Those who supported Peter would be rewarded, while those who opposed him would be punished. Peter was forcing everyone to take a stand. Neutrality was no longer an option. At the same time, he sent another group of messengers to Preobrazhenskoye, ordering his guards' regiments to arm themselves immediately and march to the monastery. In Moscow, Sophia received news of Peter's flight to the monastery. Her initial reaction, a mix of confusion and contempt. Peter had run away. The cowardly boy had fled in the dead of night. Hiding in a monastery? It seemed more like panic than a show of strength. She summoned her inner circle, Golitsyn, Shaklovati, the commander of the Streltsy, and several key noble supporters. They discussed their options. Some suggested immediately sending the Streltsy to the monastery to arrest Peter, while he was still isolated. But others warned it was too risky. Attacking a monastery would enrage the Orthodox Church and make Sophia appear the aggressor. The better strategy was to wait. Peter couldn't hide in the monastery forever. Eventually, he would have to emerge or lose credibility. Sophia took this advice, but it was a fatal mistake. In the following days, the Troitsky monastery began to fill with people. The first to arrive were Peter's Guard regiments, the Preobrazhensky and Semyonovsky regiments. Around 2,000 soldiers, fully armed and marching in orderly formation. They set up camp around the monastery and immediately began establishing defensive positions. Then came foreign officers, particularly Patrick Gordon, with several regiments under his command. Gordon was a key figure. He had prestige in the Russian army, and his support lent Peter military credibility. Next were the nobles, arriving one after another, on horseback or in carriages. Some were genuinely loyal to Peter, while others were opportunists sensing a shift in the wind. Each arrival was a small victory, each one weakening Sophia's position. The monastery transformed into a temporary court, an alternative center of power. The crucial turning point was the decision of the Orthodox Patriarch. Patriarch Adrian was a cautious politician who had remained neutral during Sophia's regency. But now he was forced to choose. Peter's representatives came to him, arguing that, according to tradition and law, the Tsar should assume personal rule at the age of 16, and the regency should end. Peter was now 17, and Sophia's continued regency was a violation of tradition. This argument was persuasive to the Patriarch, partly because it was true, and partly because he saw the balance of power shifting toward Peter. At the end of August, the Patriarch issued a formal proclamation declaring that Peter had come of age and had the right to rule personally, and that the regency should end. This proclamation was decisive. It gave Peter religious legitimacy and made Sophia's position indefensible. It was no longer just a political struggle between the Tsar and the regent. With the support of the clan leader, the military balance began to tilt. The shooting corps was not a unified force. They were dozens of independent regiments, each with its own commander and interests. Some regiments firmly supported Sophia, but many began to waver. The soldiers were not political theorists. Their loyalty was based on simple calculations. Which side would win? Which side would reward them? Which side would punish them? When news spread that the clan leader supported Peter, that more and more nobles and officers were joining him, and that foreign officers stood by his side, some units of the shooting corps began to declare neutrality, effectively refusing to fight for Sophia. Then, some units secretly sent representatives to the monastery, tentatively indicating that they might support Peter if he emerged victorious. Sophia's most reliable power base was crumbling. Sophia made a final attempt to resolve the crisis personally. In early September, she decided to go to the Troitsky monastery to negotiate face to face with Peter. It was a bold move and a desperate one. She traveled in a magnificent carriage, accompanied by a grand entourage. Nobles, servants, guards. It was an attempt to show that she was still the regent, still in authority. The journey took a full day when she arrived at the monastery. The sun was setting. She sent a messenger inside to announce her arrival and request a meeting with Peter. But Peter's response was cold and final. Regent Sophia would not be allowed into the monastery. The Tsar would not see her. She should return to Moscow. Sophia waited outside the monastery gates for 2 hours, hoping Peter would change his mind. But Peter would not relent. It was a public humiliation. The regent denied an audience by her nominal subordinate. When Sophia returned to Moscow, she knew she had already lost. In the following days, her supporters betrayed her one after another. Some publicly declared their support for Peter. Some suddenly fell ill and were unable to fulfill their duties, while others simply vanished, fleeing the capital for their country estates. By mid-September, Sophia was effectively isolated within the Kremlin, with only her most loyal supporters remaining by her side. Peter issued an ultimatum from the monastery. Sophia must relinquish all power and enter a convent, and her key supporters must surrender to face trial. If she refused, Peter hinted that he would use force. But force was no longer necessary. Sophia had no army, no allies, and no choice. In late September, she formally gave up the regency and agreed to enter the Novodevichy convent. For a woman who had once ruled Russia for 7 years, it was a tragic end. But Peter was not satisfied with Sophia's surrender. He wanted to send a stronger message, one about the consequences of opposing him. He ordered the arrest of Sophia's key supporters for trial. First among them was her lover and chief minister, Vasily Golitsyn. Golitsyn was a complex figure, one of the most educated men in Russia at the time. He owned a vast library of European books, spoke several languages, and had a genuine interest in Western culture and ideas. In different circumstances, he and Peter might have been allies, both reformers. But Golitsyn had chosen the wrong side. He had supported Sophia, and now he had to pay the price for that choice. Peter did not execute Golitsyn. That would have been too extreme for a man who had not committed treason, but merely supported the legitimate regent. Instead, he exiled Golitsyn to Siberia, to a remote region in the far north. The commander of the Streltsy, Fyodor Shaklovity, received harsher treatment. Shaklovity played a key role in the 1682 uprising, serving as the chief commander of the Streltsy during Sophia's regency and acting as her most reliable armed supporter. To Peter, Shaklovity was not merely a political opponent, but a symbol of the terror of 1682, representing those who had killed his uncles. Shaklovity was arrested and brought to the Troitsky monastery for interrogation. The purpose of the interrogation was not to uncover the truth. Peter had already decided the outcome, but to extract a confession that could justify severe punishment. Shaklovity was tortured, not through random violence, but through systematic and sustained physical torment. After days of torture, he confessed to a conspiracy to murder Peter and perpetuate Sophia's rule. Shaklovity's execution was designed as a public spectacle of terror. He was brought to Moscow's Red Square in front of St. Basil's Cathedral, before a crowd of thousands forced to watch. The method of execution was breaking on the wheel. A medieval punishment rarely used in Russia but never formally abolished. The condemned was tied to a large wheel, and the executioner systematically broke his limbs with an iron bar. The entire process was designed to be slow, subjecting the victim to maximum pain and delivering the deepest lesson of fear to the audience. Shaklovity's screams echoed across the square for hours. This was not justice. It was revenge. It was a reign of terror, and it was a message. The price of betraying Peter was not merely death, but a painful, humiliating public demise. Peter himself watched the execution from a specially constructed platform. The coup of 1689 gave Peter what he had long lacked: unchallenged political power. He was now the sole effective ruler of Russia, though he nominally shared the throne with Ivan V. He crushed Sophia's regency, eliminated her key supporters through exile and execution, weakened the political influence of the Streltsy, and established himself as an authority that brooked no opposition. Yet, the coup also revealed a fundamental truth of Russian politics. Power ultimately depended on violence or the threat of violence. The election of the Boyar Council, the blessing of the Orthodox Church, the traditional rules of succession, all were secondary to the spears of 1682 and the executions of 1689. Peter learned a lesson he would never forget. In Russia, moderation was seen as weakness. Weakness invited attack, and power could only be maintained by demonstrating a ruthless willingness to use it. But political power does not equate to transformative capability. Peter could now issue commands, yet the actual governance of Russia remained in the hands of the same institutions he had just wrested from Sophia. The Boyar Council, the advisory body of the great nobles, still controlled the administrative apparatus. The Orthodox Church continued to dominate education and ideological production. Landlords still held sway over the economy, exploiting the vast majority of the population through serfdom. The Streltsy, though weakened, remained the largest armed force in Moscow. All these structures were designed to preserve tradition and built to resist change. Peter could order reforms, but would these structures carry them out? Or would they passively resist, dilute his commands, delay implementation, and wait for his attention to turn elsewhere? Peter also faced a paradox rooted in his own experience. During his 7-year exile in Preobrazhenskoye, he developed his ideas about modernization from the Europeans in the foreign quarter, from navigation experiments, and from military training. However, he lacked experience in governing a vast empire. He had never managed a complex bureaucracy, formulated fiscal policies, coordinated the work of thousands of officials, or implemented reforms on a national scale. He had a vision, but lacked the technical knowledge to execute it. He knew Russia needed to change, but was not entirely sure how. This is why his journey to Europe in 1697 was so crucial. He needed to learn not just shipbuilding or artillery, but statecraft, the practical mechanisms of a modern state, and the administrative, fiscal, and legal systems that made European nations function effectively. In the early years after 1689, Peter was, in a sense, an apprentice. However, the experiences of 1689 permanently shaped Peter's approach to governance. He learned several key lessons that would guide him for the next 36 years. First, the concentration of power was absolutely essential. Sharing authority, creating checks and balances, or allowing independent centers of power all led to weakness and eventual crisis. Peter would become one of the most autocratic rulers in Russian history, permitting no individual or institution to challenge his authority. Second, opposition must be ruthlessly suppressed. Leniency was seen as weakness, and weakness invited defiance. Peter would employ extreme violence against anyone who opposed his reforms, from the Streltsy to his own son. Third, tradition was not sacred. It could be altered, challenged, or overturned if it hindered modernization. Peter would attack Russia's most deeply entrenched traditions. The bloody purge of 1689 also established a fundamental pattern of Peter's rule: reform driven by fear. Peter would not attempt to persuade his subjects that modernization was good, nor would he wait for consensus or build a broad coalition of support. He would command reform and then enforce it with the threat of violence against those who resisted. This approach was effective in the short term. It overcame inertia and the resistance of vested interests. But it also created deep resentment and lasting opposition in 1689. However, these long-term problems were not yet apparent. Peter, 17 years old and newly unchallenged in his power, was brimming with energy and ambition. The embassy journey of 1697 would be the next stage of this education. As the embassy convoy left Moscow, heading westward, Peter vowed that upon his return, he would change everything in the shipyards of Holland and the naval bases of England. He would discover the tools of modernization. Then he would bring these tools back to Russia, forging a new nation with iron and blood. In March 1697, the embassy departed from Moscow, embarking on a journey that would alter the course of Russian history. The convoy was vast and slow, moving comprising over 250 people, dozens of wagons, laden with gifts, documents, personal belongings, and armed guards to fend off bandits. Their first stop was Riga, a Baltic port then under Swedish control. Peter was captivated by the city. Its modern fortifications, stone-built structures, and paved streets stood in stark contrast to Moscow's wooden houses and muddy paths. Yet, he also encountered his first diplomatic embarrassment. The Swedish governor refused to allow him to inspect the city's defenses, deeming it an act of espionage. Peter was offended. He was the Tsar, albeit in disguise, and still deserving of respect. This minor clash planted a seed of resentment towards Sweden in his heart, which would later erupt into the Great Northern War years later. For now, however, he pressed on, westward, toward Holland. The journey itself was an education. Peter saw European roads for the first time, not muddy Russian tracks, but paved highways with a system of post stations and regular postal services. He saw European inns, clean, with fixed prices, beds instead of straw on the floor. He saw European agriculture, neat fields, crop rotation systems, windmills pumping water to drain lowlands. Every detail contrasted with Russia. In Russia, everything was primitive, inefficient, reliant on massive human labor. In Europe, everything was organized, systematic, reliant on technology and methods. Peter took notes in a small notebook, sketching interesting machinery, listing questions to ask. He traveled not as a tourist, but as a student, with Europe as his classroom. Every kilometer of the journey deepened his conviction. Russia needed fundamental change. In April, the embassy arrived in Königsberg, Prussia, where they were welcomed by Elector Frederick III. This was Peter's first formal diplomatic reception, revealing the complexity of his dual roles. As part of the embassy, he was officially received, attended banquets, and observed ceremonies, but as volunteer Peter Mikhailov, he was expected to remain low-key and avoid drawing attention. This contradiction created absurd situations. At banquets, Peter sat far from the main table, yet everyone knew who he was, constantly glancing his way. Frederick handled the situation cleverly, publicly respecting Peter's anonymity, while privately arranging one-on-one meetings where they could converse without the constraints of protocol. Peter appreciated this pragmatism, and the two established a friendly rapport that would benefit Russia in the years to come. In Königsberg, Peter undertook his first formal course of study. Artillery, he attended the Prussian Army's artillery school, where he learned the mathematical foundations of ballistics, how to calculate range, adjust elevation for wind and distance, and aim at moving targets. This was not the amateur experimentation of Preobrazhenskoye, but systematic, scientific training. Peter completed the full curriculum, passed the examinations, and earned an official artillery certificate, a document he proudly preserved for the rest of his life. This experience reinforced his conviction that modern warfare was not about courage or traditional tactics, but about technical knowledge and scientific application. What Russia needed was not more brave soldiers, but more educated technicians. This would become a core principle of his military reforms, driving his later efforts to establish artillery schools and engineering academies. In May, the embassy continued its journey to the Netherlands, the primary destination of the trip. The Dutch Republic in the late 17th century was Europe's most impressive success story, a small nation, partly below sea level, lacking significant natural resources. Yet, it became the center of world trade, boasting Europe's largest merchant fleet, the most advanced financial system, and the most prosperous cities. Peter wanted to understand how this miracle was achieved. As the embassy approached Amsterdam, Peter witnessed a sight he had never seen in his life. Hundreds of ships crowded the harbor, cranes loading and unloading goods, warehouses stretching for kilometers, and a network of canals running through the city like arteries. This was not just a port, it was an economic engine, a physical manifestation of capitalism. Peter was astounded that this small nation had created more wealth through trade and commerce than Russia's vast territory and population. Peter's first action in Amsterdam was to visit the shipyard of the Dutch East India Company. The Dutch East India Company was the most powerful commercial organization in the world at the time. It had its own army, its own currency, and even the authority to sign treaties with Asian nations. Its shipyards were the foundation of this empire, constructing dozens of ships each year, ranging from small coastal vessels to large East Indiamen, capable of sailing to Indonesia. Peter requested to be accepted as an apprentice worker. The shipyard supervisor initially hesitated. It was inappropriate for a Tsar to engage in manual labor, even a disguised one. But Peter insisted. He did not want special treatment or symbolic work. He wanted genuine training. In the end, the arrangement was made. He would work at the Tsardom shipyard, a smaller branch of the East India Company, where he could learn relatively discreetly. This would become one of the most important educational experiences of his life. Peter's life as a shipyard worker was earnest, not a performance he registered as carpenter apprentice. Peter Mikhailov in August 1697, starting work at 6 in the morning and finishing at 6 in the evening, 6 days a week. He lived in a simple worker's dormitory, not a luxurious residence. He wore work clothes, coarse canvas, trousers, a linen shirt, and wooden clocks, soon stained with wood shavings, tar, and sweat. His hands were covered in blisters, then thick calluses. His back ached from long hours of bending over. It was hard physical labor, not something a Tsar should be doing. But Peter persisted, day after day, week after week. He learned how to select timber, which trees to use for the keel, which for the planks, and how to spot rot or weakness. He learned how to shape the wood, bending it with steam, carving it with tools, joining it with wedges. He learned how to seal the hull, stuffing the seams with oakum, and coating it with hot tar. He learned how to install masts, calculating the correct angles, ensuring they were securely fastened, and balancing the ship so it wouldn't capsize. He learned how to make rigging, the intricate system of ropes that control the sails, each with a specific function, all requiring precise adjustment. It was complex, technical work that took years of experience to master. Peter couldn't become an expert in a few months, but he gained a practical understanding of the shipbuilding process. Not theoretical knowledge, but the kind felt in the hands and muscles. When he later ordered the construction of a navy in Russia, he would draw from this direct experience, knowing what was possible, what was difficult, and what skills and resources were needed. The other Dutch workers were curious about this unusual apprentice. Peter's height made him stand out. He towered over most Dutchmen, who were already among the tallest people in Europe. His Russian accent, his occasional aristocratic demeanor, and his evident education all hinted that he was no ordinary worker. But Peter soon discovered a limitation in Dutch shipbuilding. It was largely empirical, not theoretical. Dutch shipwrights learned through observation and imitation, through trial and error, through skills passed down over generations. They built excellent ships, but they couldn't fully explain why certain designs worked. They had rules of thumb, this ratio of length to width, this curve of the keel, but no underlying mathematics to optimize these designs or adapt to new needs. Peter wanted not just practical skills, but theoretical knowledge. He wanted to understand the science of shipbuilding, not just the art, so he began seeking other sources of learning. He visited Leiden University, where he attended anatomy lectures. He was fascinated by the mechanics of the body. He visited the laboratory of Antony van Leeuwenhoek the scientist who discovered microorganisms with his microscope. He visited other technological marvels in the Netherlands: windmill systems, printing houses, the Amsterdam Stock Exchange. Each visit expanded his understanding of how a modern society functioned. While in the Netherlands, Peter also recruited hundreds of experts to work in Russia. He did not go through formal diplomatic channels, but instead made direct contact, speaking with engineers at shipyards, sailors in taverns, and craftsmen in workshops. He offered generous contracts, high wages, tax exemptions, guaranteed housing, and religious freedom. Some were drawn by the money, others by the adventure, and some were in difficult situations in the Netherlands and sought a fresh start. By the time he left the Netherlands, Peter had recruited around 800 experts, shipbuilders, navigators, doctors, engineers, and teachers. These individuals would form the core of Russia's modernization efforts, training Russian students, establishing new institutions, and transferring technical knowledge. This was a large-scale operation of technology transfer, a key part of Peter's modernization strategy. However, the Dutch experience also had its setbacks. The most significant was the failure of the embassy's official diplomatic mission. Peter had hoped that the Dutch Republic would join an alliance against the Ottoman Empire to support Russia's expansion in the Black Sea. But the Dutch showed no interest in this proposal. They had trade relations with the Ottomans. In January 1698, after 4 months in the Netherlands, Peter decided to travel to England. He had heard that British shipbuilding methods were more scientific and theoretical. More importantly, England possessed the world's most powerful navy. Not just a merchant fleet, though that was immense as well, but warships equipped with numerous cannons designed for naval combat. Peter wanted to learn not only how to build ships for transporting goods, but also how to construct vessels capable of projecting military power. So the embassy, now smaller, as many members remained in the Netherlands to continue their studies, crossed the English Channel to England. For the first time, Peter saw the open sea, not the calm of lakes or rivers, but the true ocean, with its vast waves, endless horizon, the taste of salt, and the cries of seagulls. Though brief, this voyage was symbolic. Peter left behind the world of a land-based empire and entered the realm of maritime power. This crossing was not only geographical, but also psychological. It marked Russia's shift from an inward-looking orientation to one focused on the sea. Peter was welcomed in England by William III, who was himself Dutch, having ruled the Dutch Republic as the Prince of Orange before becoming King of England in 1688. William understood Peter's dual role. He too had been a ruler of a small nation who needed to learn how to govern a larger country. William arranged for Peter to visit the Royal Navy's shipyard at Deptford, the center of English shipbuilding. Unlike the commercial shipyards of the Netherlands, Deptford was entirely focused on warships, large, heavily armed vessels designed to withstand and deliver massive cannon fire. Peter spent 3 months there studying British shipbuilding methods. He found them indeed more scientific than the Dutch. English ship designers used mathematical models to optimize hull design, calculate stability and speed, and predict a ship's performance under various conditions. This theoretical approach was precisely what Peter had lacked in the Netherlands. He absorbed this knowledge voraciously, taking detailed notes and asking endless questions. Peter also visited other technological facilities in Britain. He went to the Greenwich Observatory, where astronomer Edmund Halley, the discoverer of Halley's Comet, demonstrated how astronomical observations could be used for precise navigation. He visited the Royal Mint at the Tower of London, where he met Isaac Newton, then serving as the Mint's warden. There is no detailed record of what they discussed, but it is reasonable to assume that this meeting left a deep impression on Peter. Newton was the greatest living scientist of the time. He visited the British Parliament and observed a debate session. Although he did not understand English and required translation, he was fascinated by the scene. Members of parliament openly debating policies, criticizing the king's ministers, and voting on laws. This was unimaginable in Russia. Peter was not interested in parliamentary democracy. He believed in autocratic power. But he was struck by the openness of the debate and the concept that ideas could be freely expressed. He began to understand that Europe's strength came not only from technology, but also from a certain intellectual freedom. Peter's time in England also marked the revelation of certain aspects of his character. He displayed a voracious appetite for learning. He wanted to see everything, understand everything, and absorb everything. He worked 14 hours a day, visiting facilities, taking notes, and asking questions. Yet, he also revealed a fiery temper and impatience. When things were not explained quickly or clearly enough, he would become irritated. He sometimes treated those he considered to be wasting his time rudely. He had little patience for formality and ceremony. He wanted substance, not ritual. He also showed a tendency towards social drinking. The British pub culture appealed to him, and he would spend evenings in taverns with sailors and workers, drinking beer and gin while discussing technology and navigation. These social interactions were not merely for relaxation, they were also opportunities for learning. In informal settings, people were more willing to share practical knowledge and speak honestly about problems and solutions. Peter understood this and seized every chance to learn. However, Peter's time in England was abruptly cut short by urgent news. In July 1698, messengers arrived from Moscow with shocking tidings. The Streltsy had rebelled. 4 regiments refused to serve on the Lithuanian border, marched on Moscow, and demanded Peter's overthrow, and, according to some reports, the restoration of Sophia. The rebellion was suppressed by Peter's allies, particularly Patrick Gordon and the Preobrazhensky regiment. But the news left Peter stunned and furious. He was in Europe learning modernization, while back home, the Streltsy, representing everything old about Russia, were trying to overthrow him this time. Peter would not be merciful. He immediately cancelled his planned visits to Italy and Austria, ordering the embassy to prepare for their return. Before leaving England, he purchased vast quantities of weapons, tools, books, and instruments, enough to fill several ships. Then he embarked on a swift journey back to Russia. Peter's return journey was rapid and focused. He was no longer a curious student, but an angry Tsar rushing back to punish the traitors. When he arrived in Moscow in September 1698, the rebellion had technically ended. Gordon's forces had defeated the rebellious Streltsy. The leaders were arrested, and the troops disbanded. But for Peter, this was not enough. He not only wanted to punish this specific rebellion, he aimed to permanently destroy the Streltsy as a political force and send a message about the consequences of opposing his reforms. Moscow would witness one of the bloodiest crackdowns in Russian history. A violent spectacle designed to eliminate traditionalist resistance through terror. Peter ordered mass interrogations, not only of those directly involved in the rebellion, but also of anyone suspected of sympathy. Interrogations were conducted simultaneously at several locations. Torture was systematic and brutal. Peter personally participated in some interrogations, not as an observer, but as an interrogator, operating the torture instruments with his own hands. He wanted confessions, a complete picture of the rebellion's network, and the name of every participant. The interrogations revealed, or claimed to reveal, a widespread network of discontent. Peter ordered one of the largest public executions in Russian history. Over 1,000 Streltsy soldiers and officers were sentenced to death. The executions were not carried out all at once, but were spread over several weeks at various locations in Moscow, ensuring that as many people as possible witnessed them. The methods were varied and deliberately chosen to maximize terror: hanging, beheading, breaking on the wheel, and burning at the stake. Some were hanged on the walls of Moscow, their bodies left on display for weeks. Others were publicly beheaded in Red Square. Some were executed outside the windows of Sophia's convent, forcing her to watch. A reminder of the consequences of rebellion. Peter wanted to ensure that everyone, nobles, clergy, merchants, peasants, understood the price of opposing him. This was not justice. It was a reign of terror, a deliberate use of violence to impose obedience. Peter also forced his nobles and officials to participate directly in the executions. Some high-ranking nobles were ordered to carry out beheadings themselves, not by professional executioners, but with their own hands. It was a test of loyalty, a way to force them into complicity with Peter's violence. But Peter was not content with merely killing the rebels. He wanted to destroy the Streltsy as an institution. After the executions, he ordered the complete disbandment of all Streltsy regiments, not just the 4 involved in the rebellion, but all of them, around 20 regiments, totaling roughly 20,000 soldiers. These men were stripped of their uniforms, weapons, and privileges. They were dispersed, some forcibly integrated into new regular army units, some sent to the frontiers as garrison troops, and some demoted to peasants or laborers. The Streltsy had once been Moscow's most powerful armed force, a political power with which the Tsar had to negotiate. Now it was gone. Peter replaced them with his own guard regiments, the Preobrazhensky and Semyonovsky, troops personally loyal to him, trained to European standards, and unburdened by old traditions. This was military modernization, but it was also a political purge. The terror of 1698 delivered the intended message. Opposing Peter was fatal. But it also produced unintended consequences. It created profound fear and resentment within Russian society, not only among those directly affected, but also among the broader population who witnessed the violence. Many Russians began to privately question whether Peter was still a legitimate Orthodox Tsar, or whether he had been corrupted by his European travels, turning into some kind of tyrannical monster. Rumors about Peter began to circulate, that he was not the real Peter, but an impostor, a foreigner who had replaced a true Tsar in Europe. These rumors were absurd, but they reflected a genuine psychological distance, the chasm between Peter and his people, and the gap between his values and traditional Russian values. This alienation would haunt him throughout his reign and make his reforms more difficult to implement. After suppressing the Streltsy, Peter immediately began to implement the reforms he had learned in Europe. He did not wait for the right moment or build consensus. He imposed reforms directly, relying on the threat of violence he had just demonstrated to suppress opposition. The first reform was symbolic, but caused immense uproar. He ordered that Russian men must shave off their beards. In the Orthodox tradition, beards hold religious significance. They are seen as part of the image of God, and shaving is considered a sin by some church authorities. However, in Western Europe, beards had fallen out of fashion, with clean-shaven faces or neatly trimmed beards being markers of a modern civilized man. Peter wanted Russian men to look like Europeans, not like barbarians. He enforced this decree among the nobility. Anyone appearing at court or in public with a beard would be forcibly shaved on the spot or face heavy fines. Peter sometimes personally used scissors to cut off the beards of nobles, humiliating them. Following the beard decree came clothing reforms. Peter banned traditional Russian attire, long robes, wide sleeves, and high boots, in cities and official settings. Instead, he mandated the adoption of European-style clothing, short coats, tight trousers, and low shoes. These reforms may seem superficial, merely changes in appearance. Yet, they had a profound psychological impact. Clothing and appearance are markers of identity, symbols of belonging. By forcing Russians to alter their appearance, Peter was compelling them to change their identity to become foreigners within their own society. The ultimate legacy of the embassy journey was not the technical skills Peter acquired, but the psychological transformation it instilled in him. After the brutal suppression in the autumn of 1698, Peter began to seriously contemplate Russia's strategic direction. Throughout the 1690s, his geopolitical focus had been on the south, seizing an outlet to the Black Sea and defeating the Ottoman Empire. He had even launched 2 campaigns against Azov in 1695 and 1696, successfully capturing the fortress in the second attempt. However, during his travels in Europe, Peter learned a disappointing reality. European nations were not interested in an anti-Ottoman alliance. Austria was preparing to seek peace with the Ottomans to focus on the impending war with France. Without European allies, confronting the Ottomans alone was too risky. But in Vienna, Holy Roman Emperor Leopold, I hinted at another possibility. Perhaps the north was a better direction, taking on Sweden and gaining control of the Baltic coast. This would provide Russia with direct sea access to Western Europe, a route far more valuable than the Black Sea Passage. Sweden emerged as a Nordic power in the 17th century, controlling Finland, Estonia, Latvia, and much of the southern Baltic coast. However, Sweden overextended itself, its empire vast yet poorly defended. More importantly, it had a new king, Charles XII, who was only 15 when he ascended the throne in 1697. To Peter and other neighboring nations, the young Swedish king appeared as a weakness, an opportunity. Russia, Saxony, whose elector was also the king of Poland, and Denmark secretly formed an alliance in 1699, planning to simultaneously attack Sweden and divide its Baltic territories. For Peter, the target was Ingria, the land around the mouth of the Neva River, where St. Petersburg now stands. This territory had belonged to Novgorod in the Middle Ages and was seized by Sweden during the turmoil of the early 17th century. Reclaiming it could be framed as a nationalist cause, not aggression, but the recovery of lost lands. Peter knew that the Russian army was not yet ready to fight Sweden. The Swedish forces were widely regarded as among the best in Europe. Well trained, disciplined, battle-hardened, employing advanced tactics, and led by excellent officers. In contrast, the Russian army, though improved since Narva, remained largely untested. However, Peter had several calculations that led him to believe war was feasible. First, Russia would not fight alone. It had allies, Saxony and Denmark, which would divert Sweden's strength. Second, Sweden appeared vulnerable, a young king, an overextended empire, multiple fronts. Third, even if Russia lost the initial battles, the war itself would provide the urgency and justification for modernizing the army. Reforms in peacetime could be resisted and delayed, but war forced action. Defeat would prove the need for more reforms, while success would prove the reforms effective. In August 1700, 2 weeks after concluding a peace treaty with the Ottoman Empire, Peter needed to ensure he would not fight on 2 fronts. Russia declared war on Sweden. The war plan involved a coordinated 3-pronged attack. Denmark would strike Sweden from the west, Saxony would besiege Riga, the main port of Latvia, and Russia would lay siege to Narva, a fortress in Estonia. In theory, Sweden would be unable to defend all fronts simultaneously and would be forced to cede some territory. Peter mobilized an army of about 35,000 men, the largest field force Russia could assemble at the time. He appointed foreign officers to command, as the Russian nobility lacked experience in modern warfare. He gathered 145 cannons, a considerable number, though many were old and of varying quality. The army marched from Moscow to the Estonian border, and then began the siege of Narva. But everything went wrong immediately. First, Charles XII proved not to be a weak youth, but a military genius, perhaps one of the greatest military commanders of his generation. When the war began, he first struck Denmark with lightning speed. He sailed directly to Copenhagen, threatening the capital with naval gunfire and forcing Denmark to withdraw from the war within weeks, without even a major battle. This left Russia and Saxony without their main ally. Then Charles turned to Russia. He shipped his main army, about 10,500 seasoned Swedish veterans, to Estonia to relieve Narva. These soldiers were the elite of the Swedish military machine. Experienced, well trained, led by capable officers, and loyal to their young king. They were known for their strict discipline and offensive spirit. When news arrived that the main Swedish army was approaching Narva, the Russian forces had already been besieging the fortress for 2 months, exhausted, cold, and demoralized. The Russian position at Narva was chaotic. The troops were spread out along an extended line around the fortress, lacking a coherent defensive formation. Command was fragmented. Peter had appointed the Duke of Devonshire, a Saxon nobleman, as the overall commander. But Russian officers distrusted him and were unwilling to follow his orders. Supplies were insufficient. The soldiers lacked adequate food, winter clothing, or proper shelter. They had been camped in the autumn mud of Estonia for 2 months, with many falling ill or suffering from malnutrition. Although the artillery was numerous, much of it was old and unreliable. When word came that Charles XII was approaching, Peter made a controversial decision. He left the army. Peter's official reason was that he needed to organize reinforcements and supplies. The real reason might have been that he did not want to be captured or killed in a potential defeat. In any case, he left a few days before the battle, leaving Crow in command. On the 30th of November, 1700, Charles XII launched an attack at Narva. This was his first major battle in his military career. He was 18 years old and had never commanded a large-scale operation. However, he demonstrated innate tactical talent. He chose to attack during a blizzard, with low visibility, which offset Russia's numerical advantage. The Swedish army advanced in narrow assault columns, charging directly at the weak points of the Russian defensive line. Their tactics were typically Swedish fast, aggressive infantry charges, utilizing bayonets and close combat, without relying on prolonged artillery exchanges. The Russian army was stunned by the speed and intensity of the attack. Many units had never fought in real combat. Their training was theoretical, and their officers were either foreigners or inexperienced Russian nobles. Panic spread as the Swedes broke through their lines. The battle lasted several hours, but the outcome was never truly in doubt. Swedish infantry systematically breached the Russian positions, causing chaos and collapse. The Russian foreign officers, Germans, French, Austrians, surrendered to Charles when they saw the battle was lost, leaving the Russian soldiers without command. Some Russian units fought bravely, particularly the Preobrazhensky and Semyonovsky Guards regiments, which held their ground for hours. But most of the army disintegrated. Soldiers threw down their weapons and fled, attempting to cross the Narva River, with many drowning in the icy waters. By nightfall, the Russian army was destroyed. Casualties were estimated at around 8,000, 10,000 dead or missing. Far more than the Swedes, who lost fewer than 1,000 men. All Russian artillery was captured, 145 cannons, representing the bulk of Russia's artillery power. The entire siege was lifted, and Narva remained firmly in Swedish hands. Narva was a military disaster, perhaps the worst defeat of Peter's entire reign. It exposed all the weaknesses of the Russian army: poorly trained soldiers, incompetent officers, outdated tactics, poor logistics, and a lack of combat experience. Europe's reaction was one of ridicule and contempt. King Louis XIV of France was said to have remarked that the Russians should go back to their forests and bears. The Swedes celebrated a brilliant victory, proving their military superiority. Charles XII was hailed as the Alexander of the North, an undefeated military genius. To many observers, the Great Northern War appeared to be over. Russia had been decisively defeated and would be forced to accept a humiliating peace, abandoning any ambitions in the Baltic. Peter's modernization project seemed to have proven itself a fantasy, and Russia seemed to confirm its reputation as a backward, incompetent nation. However, Peter's response to the Battle of Narva was surprising. He did not seek immediate peace, did not dismiss his military advisors, and did not abandon his reforms. Instead, he reframed the defeat as a learning opportunity, as evidence that even more radical reforms were necessary. In a letter to his advisors, he wrote that Narva was a necessary lesson, and that Russia now knew what it needed to improve. He publicly acknowledged that the Russian army was inferior to the Swedish forces, but he argued that this gap could be bridged. Narva also gave Peter an unexpected strategic advantage. Charles the Turret, intoxicated by victory, concluded that Russia was no longer a threat. He turned his main attention to Saxony and Poland, seeking to depose Augustus II and install a pro-Swedish king. This would occupy Charles for the next several years. From 1700 to 1706, he would fight in Poland, winning many brilliant victories, but also becoming mired in long, draining campaigns. This gave Peter precious time to rebuild his army, time to implement deeper reforms, time to absorb the lessons of Narva. Charles's strategic mistake was assuming that one battle decided the war. But wars are not determined by single battles. They are decided by a nation's ability to mobilize, recover, and exercise strategic patience. In the months following Narva, Peter launched a massive campaign of military reorganization. He ordered large-scale conscription, for the first time in Russian history, not relying on noble militias or mercenaries, but establishing a standing army based on universal conscription. Every 20 peasant households had to provide one soldier for lifelong service. This created a huge reserve of manpower. By 1705, the Russian army would have over 100,000 men, 3 times the number at Narva. But quantity was not enough. Peter also needed quality. He established military schools to train officers, no longer relying on foreign mercenaries or incompetent Russian nobles. He introduced strict disciplinary codes, modeled after Swedish and Prussian military law. He standardized training. All soldiers learned the same drills, used the same tactics, and followed the same commands. The most pressing issue was the loss of artillery. Losing 145 cannons at Narva was catastrophic. These represented the majority of Russia as modern artillery. Replacing them would require time and resources, as Russia had limited cannon foundries. Peter made a bold and controversial decision. He ordered the confiscation of bells from churches across the country to be melted down and cast into new cannons. This was pragmatic yet symbolic. The state took precedence over the church, and military necessity over religious tradition. The Orthodox Church protested, and some devout Russians were shocked by this sacrilege against sacred objects. But Peter persisted. Within months, thousands of church bells were confiscated, transported to Moscow, and melted down. By the end of 1701, Russia had a new artillery force, not as numerous as before Narva, but sufficient to equip the rebuilt army. Peter also restructured the military command. The Battle of Narva revealed the issue of relying on foreign officers. When the battle began to turn against them, they had no loyalty to fight to the end, and many surrendered to save themselves. Peter needed officers who would fight to the death, not for pay, but for their country, their profession, and their honor. He began promoting capable Russians from his guard regiments, those who had demonstrated courage at Narva, and those who showed talent in training. He also mandated that the sons of Russian nobles serve in the military, not symbolically, but starting from the bottom as ordinary soldiers or junior officers. This was a radical departure from tradition. Russian nobles had never been required to actually fight. But Peter insisted. All nobles must serve the state if they wished to retain their status and privileges. Between 1701 and 1704, while Charles II was fighting in Poland, Peter quietly took action along the Baltic coast. He avoided direct confrontation with the main Swedish forces. That would have been suicidal. Instead, he attacked isolated fortresses and small garrisons, gradually seizing territory. In 1702, Russian troops captured the fortress of Tiborg on Lake Ladoga, cutting off Swedish communications in Karelia. In May 1703, Peter occupied two small Swedish forts at the mouth of the Neva River, Nyenskans and Nyemborg. These seemed like minor victories, but the mouth of the Neva held immense strategic value. It was Russia's closest point to the Baltic Sea. The land was barren, marshes, forests, frequent floods, but the location was irreplaceable. Peter immediately made a decision that would change Russian history. He would build a new city here. Not just a military outpost, but Russia's new capital. This city would be called St. Petersburg, and it would become Peter's most enduring yet most controversial legacy. But before building St. Petersburg, Peter needed to ensure he could hold on to this territory. Sweden still controlled the Gulf of Finland, and its fleet could attack at any time. Peter needed naval power to protect his new conquest. The problem was that Russia had almost no navy, a few small boats, no warships, and no trained sailors. Between 1702 and 1704, Peter launched an urgent program of naval construction. He established shipyards in Voronezh and docks at the mouth of the Neva River. He drew on experts he had recruited from Holland and England to design and build ships. He forced Russian nobles to learn navigation. Building a fleet was expensive and time-consuming. But Peter was committed to the project. The defeat at Narva also forced Peter to confront a fundamental issue he had long avoided: how to fund his reforms and wars. Modernization was expensive. Training armies, building a navy, establishing schools, and recruiting foreign experts all required money. War was even more costly. Russia's traditional tax system was inefficient and inadequate, primarily relying on direct taxes levied on peasant households. Peter needed more revenue, and quickly he introduced a series of new taxes, some practical, others almost absurd. There was a beard tax. Those who wished to keep their beards had to pay an annual fee. There was an oak tree tax. Since oak was used for shipbuilding, there were taxes on chimneys, beehives, hats, and boots. There were also monopolies. Peter nationalized the trade in salt, alcohol, and tobacco. These taxes were oppressive and sparked widespread discontent. Ordinary Russians were already poor, and now they were being asked to pay more to fund a war and reforms they neither understood nor supported. Yet, Peter pushed relentlessly. He argued that the war was a matter of survival. If Russia did not modernize and defeat Sweden, it would be left behind and eventually dominated by stronger neighbors. Every Russian, no matter how humble, had to contribute to this national project. Complaints were seen as disloyalty, and resistance to taxes was harshly punished. Peter established new tax collecting agencies, staffed with officials who had the authority to arrest and punish tax evaders. By 1704, 4 years after the disaster at Narva, the Russian army had been transformed. It was no longer the chaotic, poorly trained force of 1700. It was now a large, standardized, and relatively well-drilled force totaling over 100,000 men. It had new artillery, though still not as good in quality as Sweden's. It had better officers, a mix of experienced foreigners and emerging Russian talents. It had improved logistics, better supply systems, better medical care, better winter gear. It also had combat experience, not against the main Swedish forces, but in dozens of minor operations against small garrisons along the Baltic coast. The soldiers learned how to maintain formation under artillery fire, how to execute bayonet charges, and how to besiege fortresses. This was no longer the army of Narva. It was ready for the real test. A confrontation with Charles the Twin himself. when he finally turned his attention back from Poland to Russia. The ultimate legacy of Narva is paradoxical. As a battle, it was a complete failure, one of the most humiliating defeats in Russian military history. But as a strategic event, it could be considered a blessing in disguise. It exposed the weaknesses of the Russian army, forcing a complete reorganization. It provided Peter with irrefutable evidence of the need for radical reforms, silencing his critics. It made Charles XX complacent about Russia, giving Peter time to rebuild. Most importantly, it tested Peter's character, revealing his most crucial qualities: resilience in the face of disaster, the ability to learn from failure, and the determination to refuse defeat as a final outcome. A different ruler might have sought peace after Narva, abandoned Baltic ambitions, and retreated into safe isolation. Instead, Peter doubled down, plunging deeper into the war and pushing reforms more radically. This decision would define the next decade, lead to the ultimate victory at Poltava in 1709, and elevate Russia to a European power. But first, Peter needed to build his new city, his window to Europe, an improbable city erected on swamps and bones. On May 27, 1703, or May 16 according to the Julian calendar, Peter personally laid the first stone of the Peter and Paul fortress on Zaiki Island, at the widest point of the Neva River. The choice of date was significant. It was Trinity Sunday, a major feast in the Orthodox calendar, lending religious legitimacy to the project. However, the location was chosen for purely practical reasons. The island occupied a strategic position on the Neva, allowing control over river traffic and defense against attacks from the Swedish fleet in the Gulf of Finland. Peter himself dug the first spadeful of earth, not as a symbolic gesture, but as actual physical labor, getting his hands dirty and setting an example. He then ordered the start of large-scale construction. Workers immediately began digging trenches, driving wooden piles, and building earthen fortifications. This was not just the beginning of a fortress, it was the birth of a new city, one that would shift Russia's geographical and psychological center of gravity. Peter named the city St. Petersburg after his patron saint, but everyone knew it was also named after himself. It was his city, his creation, his monument challenging Russian tradition. The decision to build a city on swampland seemed militarily insane. The mouth of the Neva River was still deep within Swedish-controlled territory. The Swedish fleet dominated the Gulf of Finland, and Swedish troops were stationed less than 100 kilometers away. Charles XX could decide to reclaim the area at any moment, and the entire construction project would be destroyed. But Peter's logic was both strategic and symbolic. Strategically, controlling the mouth of the Neva gave Russia its first true Baltic port. Yes, it was frozen for several months each year, but it was still more accessible and useful than Arkhangelsk on the Arctic coast. Symbolically, building a new capital on newly conquered land, facing Europe rather than Asia, sent an irreversible signal. Russia was reorienting itself. Moscow represented the old Russia, inland, eastern, traditional, and conservative. St. Petersburg would represent the new Russia, coastal, western, modern, and forward-looking. This was not merely a relocation of the capital. It was a declaration of civilizational direction, a rejection of the past, and a commitment to the future. The construction strategy was brutal yet efficient. Peter ordered the annual conscription of 40,000 serfs from across Russia to build the city. This was not voluntary service or paid labor. It was forced requisition, a tax on the nation, paid in human labor rather than money. These people, referred to as labor conscripts, were dragged from their hometowns, sometimes thousands of kilometers away, transported to St. Petersburg, and forced to work without proper tools, shelter, or food. Their tasks were daunting, draining the swamps, which required digging kilometers of drainage canals and driving wooden piles. Because the ground was too soft, Thousands of piles had to be hammered deep into the earth for each building to find a stable foundation. Digging canals. Peter wanted St. Petersburg to become the Venice of the North or the Amsterdam of the North, with a network of waterways replacing streets, building fortresses, roads, bridges, and the first structures. The work was endless, brutal, and deadly. Laborers toiled in icy malaria, infested waters up to their waists, their hands cracked and bleeding from frostbite, their backs bent and broken from ceaseless toil. The working conditions were not merely harsh, they were lethal. Workers lived in temporary earthen huts or crude wooden shacks that offered almost no protection against the harsh northern climate. In winter, temperatures could drop below -30 degrees Celsius for weeks on end. Workers froze to death in their sleep. In summer, the swamps bred mosquitoes carrying malaria and other diseases, and workers fell ill and died by the thousands. Food supplies were insufficient and irregular. In theory, workers were supposed to receive daily rations of bread and porridge. But in reality, corrupt officials often embezzled supplies, leaving the workers to labor on empty stomachs. Medical care was virtually non-existent. There were no hospitals, few doctors, and injured or sick workers were left to recover or die on their own. Accidents were common. Workers fell from scaffolding, were crushed by collapsing structures, killed by unexploded gunpowder, or drowned in the river. The outcome was predictable and horrific: mass death. Historians debate the exact numbers. Contemporary records are incomplete, and deaths often went unrecorded. But conservative estimates suggest at least 30,000 40,000 people died during the first 2 decades of St. Petersburg's construction, with some estimates reaching as high as 100,000 or more. Peter was fully aware of the human cost, but he considered it a necessary sacrifice. He occasionally visited the construction sites to inspect progress and make design changes. He would walk through the site, stepping over mud and wood chips, discussing with engineers. He even personally participated in physical labor, carrying timber, operating tools, to show the workers that no task was too menial for the Tsar to undertake. Yet, he was also indifferent to death. When advisors reported high mortality rates and suggested improving conditions or slowing construction, Peter would refuse. He argued that Russia had an endless supply of serfs. If 40,000 died, another 40,000 could be conscripted. What mattered was completing the city, quickly, regardless of the human cost. This attitude revealed a coldness in Peter's character. He was capable of viewing people as resources, expendable like timber or stone, in service to a greater goal. He was not indifferent to individual suffering. He was no sadist. But he subordinated it to the needs of the state. Modernization required sacrifice, and those sacrifices would be borne by those without the power to refuse. The serfs, the lowest rung of Russian society, with no rights, no voice, and no choice. The construction relied not only on serf labor, but also on foreign expertise. Many experts recruited by Peter from his travels across Europe were dispatched to St. Petersburg. Italian architects, Dutch hydraulic engineers, German urban planners, and French landscape designers. The chief architect was Domenico Trezzini, a Swiss Italian who designed many of the early buildings in the Baroque style. Trezzini and his team faced a unique challenge: how to build a European-style city on terrain fundamentally unsuited for construction. The solution required extensive engineering. Drainage systems to prevent flooding, wooden pile foundations to support buildings, and imported materials due to insufficient local resources. Stone was particularly scarce. There were no quarries at the mouth of the Narva River, so all stone had to be transported from afar, which was both costly and time consuming. Peter issued a decree prohibiting the construction of stone buildings elsewhere in Russia, ensuring that all available stone flowed to St. Petersburg. He even ordered that every visitor or merchant entering the city had to bring a certain amount of stone as an entry tax. The city planning was consciously Europeanized, in stark contrast to Moscow's organic, chaotic development. St. Petersburg was designed with straight, wide avenues arranged in a grid pattern, featuring central squares and monumental buildings. The main thoroughfare, Nevsky Prospect, was impressively wide, flanked by orderly building facades. Canals were dug in geometric patterns, with regular bridges and embankments. Architectural styles were mandated. Peter forbade traditional Russian wooden houses and onion, domed churches, requiring European-style stone or brick buildings, with classical facades and spires instead of domes. He even prescribed building colors, yellow, green, red, bright, and un-Russian hues, to create visual harmony and a European appearance. Every design decision aimed to make St. Petersburg look not like a Russian city, but like a Western European capital, like Amsterdam or Stockholm, not Moscow. This was not merely an aesthetic preference, it was cultural engineering. To populate the city, Peter employed coercion, just as he had with its construction. He ordered noble families to build residences in St. Petersburg and reside there at least part of the year, regardless of their personal wishes. This was not an invitation or a suggestion. It was a command, and disobedience could lead to confiscation of property or worse. For many nobles, this was a significant burden and humiliation. They were forced to abandon their comfortable lives in Moscow or their country estates and move to this remote, cold, uncomfortable, and expensive swamp city. They had to build their city homes at their own expense, following design standards set by Peter. Many resented this forced relocation, grumbling privately but obeying publicly as the consequences of refusal were too severe. Peter also ordered merchants to relocate their businesses to St. Petersburg, commanded artisans and craftsmen to settle there, and directed government agencies to move their offices from Moscow. The entire elite and administrative class of Russia were forcibly relocated from the traditional capital to Peter's new creation. This caused profound chaos and resentment, but it also achieved Peter's goal. St. Petersburg rapidly grew from nothing into a genuine city, with tens of thousands of residents. One of the most ambitious yet deadliest projects was the excavation of the Ladoga Canal, a massive hydraulic engineering endeavor designed to connect Lake Ladoga to the Neva River, allowing ships to reach St. Petersburg from Russia's interior without navigating Lake Ladoga, notorious for sudden storms and treacherous waters. The canal, approximately 100 kilometers long, required excavation through difficult terrain, frozen soil, rocky outcrops, and swampland. Work began in 1707 and would take decades to complete. The digging was carried out by forced labor. Tens of thousands of serfs were conscripted to work under the harshest conditions. They used basic tools, shovels, picks, and buckets to dig through the frozen ground. In winter, the soil froze as hard as stone, making digging nearly impossible. Yet the work had to continue. In summer, the excavated trenches would fill with water, and laborers toiled in chest-deep mud. The mortality rate was staggering. An estimated 10,000 to 30,000 workers died during the Ladoga Canal project, primarily from disease, exposure, accidents, and malnutrition. Nevertheless, the work pressed on, driven by Peter's vision of St. Petersburg as a center for trade and naval power. By 1712, after nearly a decade of construction, St. Petersburg had developed sufficiently for Peter to make a formal, symbolic decision of great significance. He declared St. Petersburg the new capital of Russia, replacing Moscow. This was not a sudden move. The relocation had been gradually taking place for years, with government institutions moving one after another. But the official proclamation marked a clear break. Moscow remained important. It was still the coronation city where czars were formally crowned. It remains the center of the Orthodox Church where the Patriarch resides. It is still Russia's largest city, with deep historical and cultural roots. But it is no longer the political capital. The center of power has shifted to St. Petersburg, to this improbable city built on swamps, to this city facing west rather than east. This relocation is highly symbolic. It physically embodies Peter's modernization project, from inland Moscow to coastal St. Petersburg, from an Eastern orientation to a Western one, from tradition to modernity. But it is also highly pragmatic. St. Petersburg's location makes it a better naval base, trading port, and connection point with Europe. Peter was repositioning Russia, both literally and figuratively, from the edge of Eurasia to the circle of European powers. Yet the construction of St. Petersburg was also a massive financial burden, further straining the state's finances, already stretched by the Great Northern War. The construction costs were astronomical, paying foreign experts, purchasing imported materials, transporting supplies hundreds of kilometers, maintaining forced labor, and building fortifications to defend against Swedish attacks. Peter diverted vast sums from state resources to the project, neglecting other needs. Taxes had to be raised to fund the construction, adding to the burden of a population already bearing the costs of war. Some economic historians estimate that between 1703 and 1725, the construction of St. Petersburg consumed about 10–15% of the Russian state budget, a massive investment that could have been directed toward the military economic development or other priorities. Critics, though they dared not speak openly, questioned whether it was worth spending so many resources on a city that might not even survive a Swedish counterattack. But Peter tolerated no dissent. For him, St. Petersburg was not a luxury or a vanity project. It was a strategic necessity. St. Petersburg also faced persistent practical challenges that threatened its survival. The most severe of these was flooding. The Neva River was notorious for its catastrophic floods, which occurred when strong westerly winds pushed water from the Gulf of Finland into the river's estuary, causing water levels to rise several meters and inundate the city. Several major floods occurred between 1703 and 1725, destroying buildings, killing residents, and damaging infrastructure. Peter ordered the construction of flood barriers and embankments, but these often proved insufficient against the most powerful floods. Another challenge was supply. The city relied on everything being transported from the Russian interior, as the local region produced almost no food or materials. Supply lines were long and fragile, vulnerable to weather, bandits, and administrative incompetence. In winter, when the rivers froze, transportation became even more difficult, and the city sometimes faced food shortages. There was also the constant fear of the Swedish threat. Despite Peter's construction of formidable fortifications, the city remained vulnerable to naval attacks. Despite all these challenges, Peter's commitment to St. Petersburg never wavered. He spent increasing amounts of time there, overseeing construction, making design decisions, and showcasing his new city to visitors and ambassadors. He built his primary residence in St. Petersburg, not a lavish palace, but a relatively modest structure that reflected his pragmatic aesthetic. He wanted St. Petersburg to be not only an administrative capital, but also a cultural and intellectual hub, a showcase for Russia's modernization. He established institutions, the Academy of Sciences, the Naval Academy, the Artillery School, the Medical College, all aimed at training a new generation of Russian professionals with European-style education. He encouraged foreigners to settle, not only engineers and architects, but also merchants, teachers, artists, creating an international, cosmopolitan atmosphere. In contrast to Moscow's insular nationalism, he even founded Russia's first public museum, the Kunstkamera. In 1714, Peter made another decision to strengthen St. Petersburg's status as the capital. He ordered that all of Russia as overseas trade must pass through St. Petersburg, not through Arkhangelsk, the traditional northern port. This was a harsh decree that caused significant disruption to merchants who relied on the Arkhangelsk route. Their entire business infrastructure, warehouses, and networks of contacts were located there. But Peter insisted, St. Petersburg needed commercial activity to survive and grow, and forcing trade through it was the way to ensure that. Although economically disruptive in the short term, this decision proved successful in the long run. St. Petersburg became a thriving port, handling most of Russia's trade with Western Europe. Merchants reluctantly relocated, established new businesses, and adapted to the new reality. By the 1720s, St. Petersburg was Russia's primary gateway for international trade, a role it would maintain until the 20th century. Historians hold profound disagreements regarding the construction of St. Petersburg. One perspective views St. Petersburg as a necessary catalyst for modernization. According to this interpretation, without the city, Russia might have remained a landlocked, isolated, and backward nation, forever confined by its traditions and geography. St. Petersburg compelled the Russian elite to look westward, created the infrastructure for maritime trade and naval power, attracted European experts and ideas, and embodied a modernization project that made it irreversible. Although the loss of life was tragic, from a long-term historical perspective, the city enabled Russia to become a European power, and ultimately a modern state. The critical perspective argues that St. Petersburg was primarily a vanity project, not a rational strategic necessity. According to this interpretation, Russia could have gained access to the Baltic Sea through other means. For example, by seizing and developing existing port cities such as Riga or Reval Tallinn. Although these cities needed to be taken from Sweden, they did not require building from scratch on swamps fundamentally unsuitable for human habitation. The location of St. Petersburg was actually poor, too far north, too cold, too prone to flooding, and too distant from Russia's population and economic centers. Tens of thousands died for an avoidable project. This perspective points out that many of Peter's successors found St. Petersburg to be a burden rather than an asset. The city survived only through continuous coercion and massive subsidies. Both interpretations are supported by historical evidence, and the debate reflects larger questions. Does modernization justify violent means? When does a ruler cross the line between necessary harshness and unnecessary tyranny? Can a great achievement, St. Petersburg did become a beautiful city and an important cultural center, justify the loss of human lives required to build it? There are no simple answers to these questions. By the early 1720s, St. Petersburg had transformed from a temporary military outpost into a true city. It had around 40,000 inhabitants, not as many as Moscow, but still substantial. It boasted impressive architecture, fortresses, palaces, churches, government buildings, noble residences, all in a European style. It featured functional infrastructure, port facilities, shipyards, canals, bridges, paved streets. It housed cultural institutions, academies, schools, museums, libraries. It possessed economic vitality, handling most of Russia's trade with Western Europe and attracting foreign merchants and investment. More importantly, it held symbolic power. It represented the realization of Peter's vision of modernization, a testament to what was possible. The very fact of the city's existence, built where everyone said it was impossible, was a declaration of Peter's willpower and his ability to impose change. St. Petersburg was Peter's most enduring legacy. It would outlive him. Yet the construction of the city also created a profound and lasting division within Russian society. The rift between St. Petersburg and Moscow was not merely geographical. It was cultural, psychological, almost metaphysical. Moscow represented Russia's soul, its history, traditions, religion, identity, state. Petersburg represented Russia's future, its ambition, modernization, Europeanization, its break with the past. The elite was split. Some embraced St. Petersburg, learned European languages, adopted European customs, and identified with Peter's vision of modernization. Others resented it, secretly remaining loyal to Moscow and the old ways, viewing St. Petersburg as a foreign imposition. The common people, peasants, merchants, artisans, mostly never saw St. Petersburg, but they heard of it, heard of the tens of thousands of serfs who died there. For many Russians, St. Petersburg was not a source of pride but of resentment, not an achievement but a symbol of oppression. This cultural rift would haunt Russia for centuries. In 1706, Charles the Torrent finally concluded his campaign in Poland. After 6 years of fighting, he successfully deposed Augustus II and installed a pro-Swedish puppet king, Stanisław Leszczyński, on the Polish throne. Saxony was defeated and forced to sign a peace treaty, withdrawing from the Great Northern War. This meant that Russia now faced Sweden alone, without allies and without any distractions for Charles. Peter knew a decisive confrontation was imminent. Charles would not be content with merely reclaiming a few fortresses along the Baltic coast. He would aim to crush Russia entirely, potentially imposing a humiliating peace treaty, or even deposing Peter and installing a more compliant ruler. This was not merely a war over territory or trade routes. It was about whether Russia would continue to exist as an independent power. Charles the Torrent began planning his invasion of Russia in 1707. His strategy was bold and ambitious. He would lead his main army, about 44,000 seasoned Swedish veterans, one of Europe's finest forces, directly from Poland toward Moscow. The plan was to advance swiftly, defeat the Russian army in a series of decisive battles, capture the capital, and force Peter to surrender. This was a strategy similar to what Napoleon would attempt a century later. A lightning strike deep into Russian territory. Charles had reason to be confident. His army had never been defeated by Peter's forces in a major battle. He was personally regarded as a military genius, and his soldiers were experienced and well trained. In contrast, the Russian army, though improved since Narva, remained largely untested against top-tier European forces. Peter's strategy against the Swedish invasion was entirely different. He would not seek a decisive battle, at least not initially. Instead, he would employ scorched earth tactics, systematically destroying everything in the path of Charles's army, burning villages and farmlands, destroying supply depots, driving off livestock, and poisoning wells. The goal was to deprive the Swedish forces of food and shelter, forcing them to carry all their supplies and slowing their advance. Meanwhile, the Russian army would engage in continuous harassment, launching small-scale attacks on Swedish reconnaissance units and supply lines, ambushing isolated detachments, but avoiding large-scale direct confrontations. This strategy required discipline and patience. The Russian forces had to resist the temptation to fight and be willing to sacrifice their own territory. Peter, drawing from his studies in Europe, understood the importance of logistics in modern warfare, the need for a constant flow of food and ammunition for an army. In January 1708, Charles's army began its invasion, advancing eastward from Poland. The initial advance was successful. The Swedish forces captured several Russian towns, repelled small Russian units, and maintained high morale. However, problems soon began to emerge. The Swedes found that every village they reached had been burned, the fields destroyed, with no food or shelter available. They were forced to carry increasingly heavy supplies, which slowed their march. The Russian roads, never good to begin with, turned into muddy swamps during the spring thaw, with wagons stuck deep in the mire and horses exhausted. Russian light cavalry, Cossacks and Kalmyk riders, continuously harassed the Swedish columns, attacking supply convoys and ambushing stragglers. Charles pressed on, but far more slowly than planned, and the condition of his army began to deteriorate. In the summer of 1708, Charles faced a critical strategic decision. The direct route to Moscow now seemed unfeasible. The distance was still great, his army was in poor condition, and Russian resistance was more tenacious than expected. His advisors suggested retreating to Poland for the winter to regroup and try again the following year. But Charles refused to retreat. It would appear weak and waste a year of campaigning. Instead, he decided to turn south into Ukraine, where he hoped to find untouched supplies, better weather, and most importantly, an ally, Ivan Mazepa. The chieftain of the Ukrainian Cossacks had secretly contacted Charles, proposing to defect from Russia and support Sweden. Mazepa promised food, shelter, reinforcements, everything Charles needed to revive his campaign. It seemed the perfect solution. Charles made the decision to turn south toward Ukraine. This would prove to be a catastrophic mistake. He abandoned the direct route to Moscow, dispersed his forces, and placed his army in a more exposed and vulnerable position. Mazepa's rebellion posed a serious threat to Peter. If the Ukrainian Cossacks joined Charles en masse, it could significantly shift the balance of power. However, Mazepa made a crucial error. He overestimated his support when he publicly declared his allegiance to Sweden. Most Cossacks refused to follow him. Their loyalty to Russia, though sometimes strained, was stronger than their personal loyalty to Mazepa. Only a few thousand Cossacks joined Mazepa, far fewer than he had promised Charles. Peter reacted swiftly. He dispatched troops into Ukraine, captured Mazepa's capital at Baturin, and destroyed the large stockpiles of supplies stored there. The destruction of Baturin was total. The city was burned, its inhabitants were slaughtered or scattered, and the supplies Charles had hoped to secure were destroyed. This meant Charles was now in Ukraine, with winter approaching, insufficient provisions without the large-scale Cossack reinforcements he had expected, and far from his main supply bases in Poland. His situation had shifted from difficult to perilous. Yet Charles refused to acknowledge any mistake. He established winter camps in Ukraine, hoping spring would bring better opportunities. The winter of 1708–1709 was one of the coldest on record. Later known as the Great Frost, temperatures plummeted to -30 to -40 degrees Celsius for weeks on end. Rivers froze solid. Birds froze mid-flight and fell from the sky. And people could freeze to death within minutes outdoors. For the Swedish army camped in Ukraine, it was catastrophic. They lacked sufficient winter clothing. Their uniforms were designed for Poland's mild climate, not Russia's bitter cold. They lacked adequate food, scorched earth tactics, and the destruction of Baturin meant supplies were critically short. They lacked proper shelter. Most soldiers slept in makeshift tents or crude huts, offering little protection. The outcome was predictable: mass freezing. Estimates suggest Charles lost about a third of his army that winter, not in battle, but to cold, hunger, and disease. Horses died in large numbers, crippling cavalry and transport. Gunpowder and weapons were damaged by the extreme cold. Morale collapsed. Soldiers were no longer confident conquerors, but suffering men struggling to survive. When spring finally arrived in 1709, Charles's army was a shadow of what it had been at the start of the campaign. Meanwhile, the Russian army spent the winter in relative comfort. They were on their own territory, with proper shelter, stable supply lines, and familiarity with the harsh climate. Peter used the winter months to prepare for the spring campaign, training troops, accumulating supplies, refining tactics, and establishing strategies. By the spring of 1709, the Russian army surpassed the Swedes both in numbers and quality. Peter now had about 45,000 regular troops, plus approximately 30,000 Cossacks and irregular forces totaling around 75,000 men. His army was no longer the untrained rabble of Narva. They were now experienced, well-trained, and well-equipped troops, led by capable officers, confident in their abilities. More importantly, they were motivated to defend their homeland and fueled by anger over the Swedish invasion. In the spring of 1709, Charles laid siege to Poltava, a medium-sized fortress town near the Dnieper River. His strategic reasoning was unclear. Poltava was not a major strategic objective, and besieging it would pin his army in one place, giving the Russians time to concentrate their forces. Perhaps Charles wanted to secure a base before advancing further, or he hoped to lure Peter into a decisive battle. Whatever the reason, the siege began in April and progressed slowly. The garrison at Poltava, though small, resisted stubbornly, and Peter ordered them to hold out as long as possible to give the main Russian army time to approach. During the siege on the 17th of June, Charles was shot in the foot by a Russian musketeer while inspecting the siege works. The wound, though not fatal, was severe. The bullet shattered the bone. Charles would be unable to walk or ride for the next few weeks. This was a major misfortune. On the eve of a crucial battle, the Swedish army lost its primary tactical advantage: Charles's personal leadership on the battlefield. He would have to command from a stretcher, unable to lead charges in person or respond swiftly to developments on the field. This wound may have altered the outcome of the Battle of Poltava. By the end of June, Peter's main army arrived near Poltava. He faced a decision whether to attack Charles's besieging forces. An attack was risky, despite his numerical advantage. The Swedes remained formidable warriors, but Peter judged the timing was right. The Swedes were exhausted, weakened, and dispersed by the siege. With their commander injured, he decided to fight. He chose a strong defensive position, an open area near Poltava. His army could construct fortifications, forcing the Swedes to attack prepared positions. He built a series of redoubts, small, earthen forts equipped with artillery, arranged in a funnel shape to force attacking troops into a kill zone. Behind the redoubts, he deployed his main army, arrayed in a solid defensive line. This was clever tactics, leveraging Russia's numerical advantage and the necessity for the Swedes to attack, shaping the battlefield to favor the defenders. Peter had learned much from Narva. At dawn on the 8th of July, 1709, the Battle of Poltava began. Charles, commanding from a stretcher, ordered the assault on the Russian positions. The Swedish tactical plan was straightforward. Infantry would advance rapidly in narrow columns, break through the Russian redoubts, and then use a bayonet charge to shatter the main Russian line. This is Sweden's classic tactic, effective in many battles, relying on speed, aggression, and close combat. However, at Poltava, it encountered several issues. First, the Russian fortifications were stronger than expected and more effectively defended. The Swedish columns were forced to slow down, exposed to heavy artillery fire, and suffered significant casualties. Second, the absence of Charles on the battlefield created coordination problems. Different Swedish units advanced at different times, losing the advantage of synchronized attacks. Third, the Russian soldiers did not panic as they had at Narva. They held their positions, fired in an orderly manner, and did not collapse under the Swedish charge. After several hours of intense fighting, the Swedish attack was halted. They failed to break through the Russian lines, suffered heavy losses, and began to lose cohesion. By noon, the momentum of the battle had shifted. The Swedes, exhausted and weakened, were forced onto the defensive. Peter saw the opportunity and ordered a counterattack. The Russian army, preserved fresh and in good order, advanced against the depleted Swedes. The numerical advantage, the Russians outnumbered them nearly 3-1, now became decisive. The Swedish lines began to crumble. Some units attempted an orderly retreat, but others panicked and fled. Charles, from his stretcher, desperately tried to reorganize his troops, but the situation was beyond control. By the afternoon, the Swedish army was shattered. Soldiers threw down their weapons and ran, pursued by Russian cavalry, with thousands killed or captured. Charles himself, still on his stretcher, was rescued from the battlefield by his guards and fled southward, seeking refuge in Ottoman territory. He left behind his army, approximately 16,000 Swedish soldiers dead or captured. The immediate aftermath of Poltava was immense. For Russia, it was an extraordinary victory, a revenge for the humiliation at Narva in 1700, a proof of the effectiveness of nearly a decade of reforms, and a confirmation of Russia as a military power. Peter's strategy and tactics, scorched earth, defensive positions, leveraging numerical superiority, were executed perfectly. His army, which he had spent 10 years building and training since 1700, proved it could defeat the best in Europe. For Sweden, it was a catastrophe. Not only losing the battle, but the entire army, the initiative and its status as the dominant northern power. Charles, though alive, was now an exile in the Ottoman Empire, cut off from his country and unable to lead. Sweden would never fully recover. The Battle of Poltava also had profound diplomatic consequences. Before the battle, European nations largely ignored Russia or treated it with contempt as a semi-barbaric peripheral power. After Poltava, perceptions shifted abruptly. Russia had defeated Charles the Torrent, the seemingly invincible king of Sweden. If Russia could accomplish this, it was clearly not a peripheral force. It was a genuine power that had to be taken seriously and factored into European diplomacy. European ambassadors flocked to Peter's court, seeking alliances, offering treaties, and requesting trade agreements. Saxony, which had been forced by Charles to withdraw from the war in 1706, now rejoined the fight against Sweden. Denmark also re-entered the war. Poland shifted its support to Russia. Suddenly, Sweden was no longer facing an isolated Russia, but a formidable coalition. The Battle of Poltava also solidified St. Petersburg's status as the capital. Before the battle, the city's future was uncertain. Had Sweden won, it would have been destroyed or reconquered. However, Poltava ensured Russian control over the Baltic coast, securing St. Petersburg. The city could now grow and develop without threat, fulfilling its intended role as a window to Europe. In the years following the battle, St. Petersburg experienced rapid expansion, more buildings, more residents, more commercial activity, and more cultural institutions. It truly became the capital, not only in name but also functionally and symbolically. Peter was able to invite European diplomats and visitors to St. Petersburg, showcasing Russia's modernization and impressing them. The city became a living advertisement for Russia's transformation. For Peter personally, Poltava was the pinnacle of his life, the validation of all his work. He had taken enormous risks, challenging Sweden, building St. Petersburg, imposing radical reforms, draining national resources for modernization, betting that Russia could transform itself quickly enough to survive. Poltava proved him right. The reforms worked. The new army defeated the old enemy. New tactics proved superior to traditional methods. The new Russia demonstrated it could compete with and defeat the best of Europe. In the celebrations after the battle, Peter displayed an unusual sense of humility. He called himself a student of the Swedes, saying that at Narva they taught him how not to fight. And now at Poltava, he proved he had learned the lesson. This was not mere false modesty. It reflected Peter's core belief: learning, adapting, and recovering from failure were more important than initial success. But the war was not yet over. Although the main Swedish army had been destroyed, Sweden still controlled significant territories: Finland, parts of Estonia and Latvia, and some fortresses along the southern Baltic coast. Charles the Twain, though in exile in the Ottoman Empire, refused to make peace. From 1709 to 1721, Another 12 years of war ensued, primarily consisting of sieges, naval engagements, and diplomatic maneuvers, rather than major land battles. This period was draining for Russia, continuous military operations, immense financial costs, and the demand for constant vigilance and effort. Yet it also gave Peter time to consolidate his victories, secure his conquests, and systematically seize Sweden's remaining Baltic territories. One by one, Swedish fortresses fell: Viborg, Riga, Reval. By the mid-1710s, Russia controlled the entire eastern coast of the Baltic Sea. On the 10th of September, 1721, in the Finnish city of Nystad, Russia and Sweden signed a formal peace treaty, ending the Great Northern War. The terms of the Treaty of Nystad were highly favorable to Russia. It gained Latvia, Estonia, Ingria, and parts of Finland, totaling approximately 17,000 square kilometers of territory and about 2 million new subjects. The treaty formally confirmed Russia's status as a Baltic power. The window to Europe that Peter had sought for 2 decades was now secure, legal, and permanent. St. Petersburg was no longer a vulnerable outpost. It was the capital of a great empire. 2 months after the treaty was signed, in November 1721, the Russian Senate and the Holy Synod bestowed upon Peter the new title, Emperor of all Russia, along with the honorifics the Great, and Father of the Fatherland. Russia was no longer merely a kingdom, but an empire. Peter had created the Russian Empire, which would endure until 1917. Although the victory at Poltava secured Russia's status as a European power, it could not resolve the most painful issue in Peter's personal life: his relationship with his son, Alexei. Alexei Petrovich, born in 1690, was the son of Peter and his first wife, Eudoxia Lopukina. From the outset, the marriage was disastrous. Eudoxia was a traditional Russian noblewoman, devoutly orthodox, conservative, uneducated, and entirely opposed to Peter's modernization plans. She represented everything Peter sought to destroy: old Moscow, traditional values, and resistance to change. In 1698, Peter forced her into a convent, effectively ending the marriage. Though they never formally divorced, Alexei was 8 years old at the time, and this separation had a profound psychological impact on him. He was taken from his mother, sent to be educated by tutors chosen by Peter, and expected to become Peter's heir. But from childhood, Alexei showed fundamental differences from his father. Peter was energetic, practical, obsessed with technology, and an indefatigable worker. Alexei was introverted, bookish, interested in religion, and had no talent for physical labor or military training. Peter loved shipyards, military drills, and being with soldiers and craftsmen. Alexei loved books, religious ceremonies, and being with monks and traditional nobles. Peter tried to mold Alexei in his own image, forcing him to study mathematics, geometry, artillery, navigation, and foreign languages. He sent Alexei to Germany to study, hoping a European education would transform him. But most of these efforts failed. Alexei studied out of compulsion, not interest. He had no emotional connection with his father. Peter was too busy with wars and reforms to be a real father, and Alexei was too fearful and resentful of Peter to love him. Even worse, Alexei began to associate with those who opposed Peter's reforms: conservative nobles, traditional Orthodox clergy, and those who secretly longed for the old Russia. These people saw Alexei as a hope. If Peter died, Alexei would inherit the throne, and they believed he would reverse the reforms, restore traditions, and bring Russia back to the right path. Alexei did not actively encourage these hopes, but he did not outright reject them either. He privately sympathized with these sentiments. He indeed believed his father's reforms were too radical, too violent, and too detached from Russia's true spirit. He dreamed of a different Russia, less warlike, more devout, and more respectful of tradition. Although these sentiments never turned into active conspiracies, they were dangerous to Peter. If Alexei were to inherit the throne, 30 years of modernization could be undone, and Russia might revert to isolation and backwardness. Peter began to publicly express his dissatisfaction with Alexei as his heir. He wrote letters to Alexei, using harsh language to criticize his laziness, his incompetence in military affairs, and his poor choice of friends. He threatened to strip Alexei of his inheritance rights. These letters were not private. They were deliberately leaked to the court, ensuring everyone knew of the Tsar's disappointment in his son. For Alexei, this was humiliating. He was trapped in an impossible situation. He could not meet his father's expectations, because he was simply not the kind of person Peter wanted. Yet he could not renounce his inheritance either, as that would leave him worthless and without purpose. The tension reached a crisis point in 1711, when Peter ordered Alexei to either improve by actively engaging in military and administrative affairs to prove he could be a competent ruler, or to renounce his inheritance and enter a monastery. Alexei was paralyzed by this ultimatum. He did not want to become a monk. That would mean completely abandoning secular life. Yet he could not transform himself into the kind of heir Peter desired. In desperation, he made a fateful decision. In November 1716, he fled Russia. He secretly left St. Petersburg and traveled to Vienna, where he sought the protection of Holy Roman Emperor Charles VI. His wife Charlotte, a German princess chosen for him by Peter, had recently died, and he fled with his mistress Afrosinia. His escape plan was poorly conceived. He seemed not to have considered the consequences, had no long-term strategy, and simply wanted to escape his father's pressure. Charles VI, unwilling to offend Peter, but also reluctant to turn away a prince seeking asylum, hid Alexei in a remote castle in Naples, hoping the problem would resolve itself. Peter's reaction to his son's flight was a mixture of anger and deep personal hurt. It was not only a political embarrassment. The heir to the throne fleeing Russia was a massive scandal, but also a personal betrayal. Peter interpreted Alexei's escape as a rejection of everything he stood for. He vowed to find Alexei and bring him back. He dispatched his most reliable agents, Peter Tolstoy and Alexander Rumyantsev, to Europe to locate Alexei. Both men were seasoned diplomats and ruthless enforcers, willing to use any means necessary. After months of searching, they found Alexei in Naples by the end of 1717. They faced a daunting task, persuading Alexei to return to Russia voluntarily. An international incident with Charles VI would ensue if they attempted to kidnap him. They employed a carefully orchestrated combination of deception and manipulation. Tolstoy and Rumyantsev conveyed Peter's message to Alexei. If he returned voluntarily, he would receive full pardon without punishment, could renounce his inheritance rights, and live quietly without involvement in political or military affairs. The letter was even personally signed by Peter, appearing sincere and generous. Alexei was initially suspicious, but Tolstoy and Rumyantsev continued to pressure him. They described the consequences if he did not return. He would be stripped of his inheritance, permanently exiled, possibly assassinated, and his mistress and supporters would face terrible reprisals. At the same time, they promised peace, forgiveness, and the possibility of a simple life if he returned. Alexei, weary, isolated, and fearful, eventually agreed. In February 1718, he returned to Moscow. Initially, Peter seemed to keep his promise. Alexei publicly renounced his inheritance and begged for forgiveness. Peter publicly forgave him. But within weeks, the situation changed dramatically. Peter ordered an investigation into Alexei's associates and his activities during his flight. Interrogations began, not only of Alexei, but also of his supporters, servants, priests, and anyone connected to him. These interrogations involved torture, systematic, brutal, physical torment designed to extract confessions. Those interrogated were forced to confess to various conspiracies. that Alexei planned a coup, that he intended to reverse all reforms after Peter's death, that he conspired with foreign powers, that he wished for Peter to die in the war. Many of these confessions were likely false, extracted under torture, saying what the interrogators wanted to hear. But they created a narrative of conspiracy, a story in which Alexei was not just a disappointed son, but a dangerous traitor, a threat to the security of the state. Peter then took the extraordinary step of ordering a formal trial for his own son on charges of treason. This was unprecedented in Russian history, a Tsar putting his heir on trial and potentially executing him. The trial took place in June 1718 in St. Petersburg, before about 127 senior nobles and officials, who formed a special tribunal. The evidence consisted mainly of confessions extracted through torture, along with Alexei's own admissions, in which he confessed to his disloyal thoughts and connections with anti-reform factions. The legal issues were murky. Alexei had not actually launched a coup or engaged in military action. He had merely fled and privately criticized his father's policies. Traditionally, this would not have constituted a capital offense. But Peter exerted immense pressure on the court, making it clear that he wanted a death sentence. The tribunal, fearful of opposing the Tsar, declared Alexei guilty of treason and sentenced him to death. However, Alexei was never formally executed on the 26th of June, 1718. 2 days after the verdict, officials announced that Alexei had died of a stroke or natural causes in his cell at the Peter and Paul fortress. The true cause of his death may never be fully known. The most likely explanation is that he died from torture during the interrogation. He was systematically tortured in the weeks leading up to his trial in an attempt to extract more confessions and a list of accomplices. Historical records indicate he was subjected to at least 2 floggings, each consisting of dozens of lashes, likely with the knout, a particularly brutal instrument of torture. The cumulative effect of such physical trauma could have led to his death, from internal bleeding, organ failure, or infection in his weakened state. Some historians speculate that Peter may have personally participated in the torture, or even ordered a private execution, but this remains debated and unproven. Regardless of the precise details, the core fact is clear: Peter created the conditions that led to his own son's death. He established the interrogation, authorized the torture, presided over the trial, and ensured the death sentence. Even if he did not physically kill Alexei, he was morally and politically responsible for the death. This was one of Peter's darkest acts, not in the heat of war, not out of strategic necessity, but a cold, calculated decision to eliminate his own son, whom he saw as a threat to his reform legacy. Alexei's death sent shockwaves through Europe. Peter, who had elevated Russia's status after Poltava, and worked to have Russia seen as a civilized European nation, was now viewed as a barbaric Eastern tyrant, a monster who killed his own child. Even commentators sympathetic to modernization were horrified by this act. However, within Russia, the reaction was more complex. Some, particularly those who benefited from Peter's reforms, such as the new nobility, military officers, and foreign experts, viewed Alexei's death as tragic but necessary. They argued that Alexei represented a genuine threat had he succeeded to the throne. He would have reversed the reforms, dismantled the institutions Peter had established, and potentially triggered civil war between reformers and traditionalists. From this perspective, Alexei's death was a sacrifice to preserve the larger national project. Others, especially conservatives, traditional nobles, and devout Orthodox believers, saw Alexei's death as a tragedy and confirmation of the brutality of Peter's rule. They regarded Alexei as a victim, a gentle and pious young man destroyed by his father's impossible expectations, a martyr killed by Peter's obsession with power and control. For Peter personally, Alexei's death likely had a profound psychological impact, though he never publicly expressed remorse. In the following years, Peter seemed to grow more paranoid, more suspicious, and more prone to sudden outbursts of violence. His health began to deteriorate. He suffered from painful bladder issues, possibly a urinary tract infection or kidney stones, causing frequent and intense pain. Some biographers speculate that these physical ailments were at least partly psychosomatic, a manifestation of his unacknowledged guilt over what he had done to his son. But Peter never retreated. He never publicly questioned his decision regarding Alexei. He continued his reforms, if anything more intensely, as if trying to prove the sacrifice was worth it by making modernization succeed. Alexei's death also created a succession crisis. Peter now had no obvious heir. He had several children with his second wife Catherine, a woman of Lithuanian peasant origin, whom he married in 1712, but most died in infancy. Only 2 daughters, Anna and Elizabeth, survived to adulthood, but under traditional inheritance laws, women were excluded from succession. Peter could have named Catherine as his heir. He had already crowned her as empress in 1724, hinting at this intention. But it would have been controversial and unprecedented. The uncertainty of succession would lead to political instability after Peter's death. The Alexei affair also revealed a fundamental contradiction in Peter's modernization project. Peter claimed he was rationalizing Russia, making it more European, civilized, and governed by law. Yet his treatment of Alexei, arbitrary arrest, torture to extract confessions, manipulation of the trial, and possible judicial murder, was all autocratic and barbaric, not rational or civilized. Peter desired a modern Russia, yet he employed the most autocratic means to achieve it. He sought the rule of law, but placed himself above it. He aimed for education and reason, yet imposed them through violence and fear. These contradictions were not merely philosophical, they were practical, and they would haunt Russia long after his death. The death of Alexei also instilled a lasting culture of fear among Russia's upper classes. If Peter was willing to kill his own son, what would he do to anyone who opposed him? This question loomed over every noble, every official, and anyone who might question Peter's policies. It fostered an atmosphere of terror and obedience, where people learned to harbor private doubts while displaying public loyalty, regardless of their true feelings. This political culture, founded on fear rather than consent, on obedience rather than participation, would come to define Russian autocracy for centuries to come. Historians continue to debate whether Peter genuinely believed Alexei was a threat or simply saw a convenient pretext to eliminate an heir who would undermine his legacy. Evidence supports both interpretations. On one hand, there was indeed a conservative faction gathering around Alexei, who genuinely hoped to reverse some of the reforms. These individuals, traditional nobles, old church clergy, and those who had lost power and status under the new order, were more than just abstract threats. They had motives, connections, and potentially the opportunity if Peter were to die suddenly. From this perspective, Peter sincerely believed Alexei's existence threatened everything he had built, and that eliminating this threat was painful but necessary. On the other hand, Alexei never truly led a conspiracy, never organized opposition, and never took any initiative against his father. He is primarily passive, a figure onto whom others project their hopes, rather than an active conspirator. The evidence of conspiracy mainly comes from confessions extracted through torture, unreliable, potentially false, and distorted to match Peter's suspicions. From this perspective, Peter largely created the threat he claimed to be fighting, using Alexei as a scapegoat to justify a broader crackdown on opposition. The truth likely lies somewhere in between, a mix of genuine concerns and political calculations, sincere fears, and opportunistic tyranny. Alexei's tragedy also raises human questions about the father-son relationship. Beyond political maneuvering, it is a tragedy between father and son. Two people unable to understand or connect with each other. Two people who wanted fundamentally different things. Two people ultimately headed toward a fatal conflict. Peter wanted Alexei to become a miniature version of himself, energetic, militaristic, modern, and devoted to reform. Alexei desired a completely different life, contemplative, religious, peaceful, and connected to tradition. Neither was willing or able to compromise. Peter could not accept a son who differed from him, and Alexei could not force himself to become the person his father wanted. The result was tragedy. Not just the death of one man, but the failure of two human beings. A father unable to love a son who was not what he wanted, and a son unable to escape his father's expectations. This personal tragedy was magnified by the weight of politics and history. But at its core, it is a story of irreconcilable differences between father and son, one that ended in the most tragic way possible. For those who view Peter as a hero and modernizer, the Alexei affair is a troubling stain. A reminder that great achievements can coexist with personal cruelty. For those who saw Peter as a tyrant, Alexei's death was the ultimate proof that Peter's modernization was built on violence and oppression, and that he was willing to sacrifice anyone and anything, even his own flesh and blood, for his power and vision. Both perspectives hold truth. Peter was genuinely devoted to modernizing Russia, and his reforms did bring significant changes, transforming Russia into a European power. Yet, he was also an autocratic ruler who employed extreme violence and was willing to sacrifice countless lives, including his sons, to achieve his goals. These two realities cannot be separated. Reform and violence were two sides of the same project. Understanding Peter requires holding both in mind, acknowledging the achievements without excusing the cruelty, and recognizing the cruelty without denying the achievements. This complexity makes Peter one of history's most controversial and compelling figures. After Alexei's death, Peter became more isolated, withdrawn, and reliant on a small circle of advisors and his wife Catherine. He continued to work. Reforms never ceased, and new projects were always underway. But some contemporaries noted that he seemed more weary, more troubled by pain, and more aware of his own mortality. He lived only 7 years after Alexei's death, passing away in January 1725 at the age of 52. During those years, he would push through more reforms, administrative restructuring, church reforms, educational initiatives, but he never again designated a clear successor. When he died, he left a power vacuum that would lead to decades of palace coups and succession crises. A period of instability that might have been avoided had he handled Alexei's situation differently. This was the final irony of his most controversial decision. In trying to secure his legacy, he may have made it more fragile. Peter's modernization was not limited to military and administrative reforms. He also sought to fundamentally transform Russian society itself, reshaping the way Russians thought, behaved, and presented themselves. This cultural revolution was more invasive and controversial than his military or political reforms, as it touched upon the intimate realms of daily life and the core of identity and tradition. Peter believed that modernization was not merely a matter of technology or organization. It was a psychological and cultural issue. Russians needed not only to learn how to build ships or operate cannons, but also to learn how to think and act like Europeans. Only through such a profound cultural transformation could Russia truly become part of European civilization. Peter's Cultural Revolution began after his return from Europe in 1698 and continued until the end of his reign, encompassing nearly every aspect of life, from clothing to the calendar, from social customs to language. The most famous and symbolic reform was the beer tax, introduced in 1698. In traditional Russian society, beards held profound cultural and religious significance. They were seen as a mark of masculinity, a symbol of piety, and part of the image of God. The Orthodox Church taught that humans were created in God's image, and shaving was considered a desecration of that image. Devout Russian men took pride in their long untrimmed beards, but in Western Europe, fashion had shifted. Beards were viewed as outdated, barbaric, and uncivilized by the late 17th century. A clean-shaven or neatly trimmed beard was the mark of a modern, cultured gentleman. Peter decided that Russian men must adopt a European appearance. Upon his return from Europe in August 1698, he attended a court banquet and personally used scissors to cut off the beards of several high-ranking nobles without warning or explanation, humiliating them in front of others. A few days later, an official decree was announced. All Russian men, except peasants and Orthodox clergy, must shave off their beards. Those who wished to keep their beards had to pay an annual tax, a substantial amount for nobles and merchants, and a smaller sum for city residents. Those who paid the tax received a copper token as proof of payment, inscribed with the words, "The beard is a useless burden." Enforcement was strict. Officials were dispatched to city gates to inspect men entering. Those who had not paid the tax but still had beards were forcibly shaved on the spot, often with dull knives or razors, leading to cuts and infections. For many Russian men, this was a profound humiliation and psychological trauma. Some secretly preserved their shaved beards, intending to be buried with them after death, hoping to appear before God in their complete form in the afterlife. Following the beard tax came an equally extensive clothing reform. Peter forbade traditional Russian attire, long floor-length robes, kaftans, wide sleeves, and tall, soft boots, in cities and official settings. He mandated the adoption of European-style clothing, short coats, tight trousers, low shoes, and tricorn hats. He even specified details: the length of coats, the style of collars, and the number of buttons. Once again, enforcement was strict. Those wearing traditional clothing were fined, or worse, their garments were publicly cut to the prescribed length. Peter ordered wooden models displaying the permitted clothing styles to be placed at the main city gates, leaving no confusion about the law. These clothing reforms were not merely aesthetic. They had profound social and psychological impacts. Clothing was a marker of identity, a symbol of status, and an expression of belonging. By forcing Russians to change how they dressed, Peter was compelling them to change how they saw themselves. He is creating a visual rupture between Old Russia and New Russia, between Moscow and St. Petersburg, between tradition and modernity. Russians dressed in European clothing no longer resembled their ancestors. They looked more like Germans or French. This was intentional. Peter wanted Russians not only to imitate Europeans, but also to see themselves as Europeans, internalizing a European identity. Peter also reformed social customs and etiquette. Traditional Russian social life was highly segregated. Noblewomen lived in the family's secluded quarters Tsardom, separated from male visitors and rarely appearing in public. Social gatherings were gender segregated, formal, and strictly governed by traditional protocols. Peter decided this had to change. He introduced assemblies, mixed, gender social gatherings modeled after European salons and court receptions. Beginning in 1718, Peter mandated that the high nobility of St. Petersburg host regular assemblies in their homes. These events had to be open to all people of appropriate rank, include both men and women, and feature music, dancing, card games, and conversation. Peter even published detailed rules on how to organize the assemblies, when to start, what refreshments to serve, how to arrange the rooms, and how to introduce guests. For many conservative Russian nobles, these assemblies were scandalous, exposing wives and daughters to the gaze of strange men, forcing women to participate in activities previously reserved for men, such as dancing and card games, and breaking deep-seated social taboos about proper behavior. But Peter insisted, personally attending many assemblies to ensure compliance. He would walk around the room, compelling shy women to dance, correcting those who did not follow proper etiquette, and sometimes handling resistors roughly. The gatherings gradually fostered a new social culture. Women became more publicly visible, began participating in public life, and gained access to education and experiences previously denied to them. This ultimately led to the emergence of a more educated and capable class of Russian women in the late 18th century. However, the transition was difficult, and many women, particularly from the older generation, found being forced into the public sphere traumatic and humiliating. Peter also reformed the calendar and timekeeping. Traditionally, Russia used the Byzantine calendar, which counted years from the creation of the world, and began the new year on the 1st of September. In 1700, Peter ordered Russia to adopt the Julian calendar, though not the more accurate Gregorian calendar used in much of Europe, counting years from the birth of Christ and starting the new year on the 1st of January. This seemingly technical change carried profound symbolic significance. It synchronized Russia with European time and severed its connection to the Byzantine past. To celebrate the introduction of the new calendar, Peter organized grand festivities in St. Petersburg, featuring fireworks, parades, and public banquets, all held on the 1st of January, marking the first time the new year was celebrated in Russian history. He also reformed the education system. Peter recognized that lasting modernization required an educated populace, not only specialists and technicians, but also a broader class of literate and mathematically capable citizens who could understand and support the reforms. He established various specialized schools, the Naval Academy to train naval officers, the Artillery School for gunners, the Medical School for doctors, and engineering schools for architects and technicians. He also attempted to create a broader educational system, ordering each province to set up schools teaching basic literacy, arithmetic, and geometry. These cipher schools were primarily intended for the sons of nobles and merchants, and although underfunded and poorly organized, they represented the first attempt in Russian history to establish a secular state education system. Peter also mandated that the sons of nobles receive a basic education. They had to demonstrate literacy and mathematical skills before they could marry or inherit property. This was radical. It transformed education from an optional privilege into a compulsory obligation. Many nobles resisted, viewing it as an unnecessary burden. But Peter's intention was clear. The new Russia would be governed by an educated elite, not by ignorant landowners. Language also became a target of reform. Peter sought to simplify and modernize written Russian, making it easier to learn and use. In 1708, he introduced a new civil alphabet, Grezdansky Schrift, which simplified the old Cyrillic script by eliminating some archaic letters and making the typeface more similar to Latin letters. The new alphabet was used for secular books and documents, while the Old Church Slavonic alphabet was retained for religious texts. This distinction was symbolic. It visually separated the sacred from the secular, the church from the state, and tradition from modernity. Peter also encouraged the publication of secular books. Previously, most printing in Russia was limited to religious texts. He ordered the translation and publication of European works on science, history, and philosophy. He established Russia's first newspaper, Vedomosti, in 1703, although it primarily served as a propaganda tool reporting Peter's achievements. It represented a new form of public information dissemination. Peter also implemented significant reforms within the church itself. The Orthodox Church traditionally held immense power and autonomy in Russian society, led by a patriarch who was nearly equal to the Tsar in certain matters. Peter distrusted the church as an independent center of power. He viewed it as a potential obstacle to reform, a bastion of conservatism and traditionalism. When Patriarch Adrian died in 1700, Peter refused to appoint a successor. Instead, he left the position vacant for years, effectively weakening the Church's leadership. Then in 1721, he completely abolished the Patriarchate, replacing it with a state-controlled council, the Holy Synod, composed of bishops and lay officials appointed by him. This reform effectively transformed the Orthodox Church into a government department, subordinate to the authority of the Tsar. The Church lost its financial independence. Its vast lands and wealth came under increasing state control. It could no longer serve as a counterbalance to state power. It became an instrument of the state. This was a profound shock to many devout Russians. The Church had always been central to Russian identity, the guardian of culture, and the mediator between the people and God. Now it was demoted to a bureaucratic institution. Some religious conservatives even began to view Peter as the Antichrist. Literally, a figure who pretended to be Christian but was actually an agent of the devil, sent to destroy the true faith. These fears were exacerbated by Peter's occasional mocking attitude towards religious rituals. He would organize satirical drunken assemblies that parodied church ceremonies, appointing a pope of all jesters and forcing participants to engage in blasphemous acts that mimicked sacred worship. While these events were partly in jest and served as a release of tension, they also reflected Peter's deep-seated skepticism towards religion. He respected it as a tool for social control and a source of moral education, but he felt no obligation to adhere to its doctrines or respect its authority when they conflicted with his political goals. Peter also implemented fundamental reforms regarding the role and obligations of the Russian nobility. Traditionally, Russian nobles enjoyed privileges, land serfs, tax exemptions, through hereditary status, without any requirement to serve the state. Peter viewed this as parasitic and inefficient. He introduced the principle of service nobility. All nobles, regardless of their family background, had to serve the state in order to retain their privileges. The table of ranks established in 1722 formalized this system. It created 14 ranks for civil, military, and court service. Advancement was based on merit and service, not birth. In theory, a commoner could rise to noble status through talent and effort, while a lazy noble could lose their standing. In practice, old noble families still retained significant advantages. But the table of ranks did introduce some social mobility and the principle of meritocracy. More importantly, it linked noble privileges to state service. You served the state, and thus you earned privileges, not the other way around. This was a fundamental redefinition of traditional feudal relationships. The system created a new category of nobility, the service nobility, whose identity and loyalty were closely tied to the state, rather than to family or tradition. These individuals would become key implementers and supporters of Peter's policies. Peter also sought to reform Russia's economic structure. Traditionally, the Russian economy was primarily agricultural, based on serfdom. The vast majority of the population were serfs, legally bound to the land of their birth and under the control of noble landowners. Peter did not abolish serfdom. Doing so would have alienated his main base of support, the nobility. But he attempted to establish a complementary industrial and commercial economy. He established state-owned factories to produce military necessities, iron foundries, gunpowder mills, and textile mills for army uniforms. He encouraged private entrepreneurs to set up factories by offering tax incentives and providing skilled labor, sometimes through the forced assignment of serfs to factories. He sought to develop the mining industry. Russia had vast mineral resources, including iron, copper, and silver, but these were largely untapped. In the Ural Mountains, new mines and smelters were established, creating the core of Russia's industrialization. These industries were rudimentary and small in scale compared to those in Britain or the Netherlands, but they represented a significant beginning. The first step for Russia to transition from a purely agricultural economy to a more diversified one. Peter also sought to develop commerce and trade. He provided privileges for domestic merchants, established merchant guilds, and improved transportation infrastructure, building roads, digging canals, and establishing a postal system. He promoted St. Petersburg as a trading port, offering favorable conditions to foreign merchants operating there. The results were mixed. The Russian economy did become more complex, but the changes were slow, and Russia remained far behind the economic development of Western Europe. The cumulative effect of all these reforms was profound. By the end of Peter's reign, Russian society, at least on the surface, had been transformed. The urban elite now wore European clothing, spoke French or German, in addition to Russian, attended mixed-gender social gatherings, and sent their sons to European-style schools. St. Petersburg had become a true European capital, complete with Baroque architecture, regular diplomatic receptions, and cultural institutions. Russia possessed a modernized military, a functional bureaucracy, and emerging industrial sectors. It was recognized as a European power and taken seriously in international diplomacy. But how deep did this transformation go? Did Peter succeed in reshaping the Russian soul, or did he merely alter its outward appearance? This question remains debated among historians. One perspective holds that Peter's cultural reforms fundamentally transformed Russian society, creating a new westernized elite that genuinely internalized European values and worldviews. This elite, though small in number, representing only a fraction of the population, would dominate Russian culture and politics for the next 2 centuries. They were true Europeans, comfortable with European literature, art, philosophy, and science. They saw themselves as part of European civilization, not as inhabitants of Asia's periphery. Without Peter's reforms, this transformation would not have occurred, and Russia might have remained culturally isolated. Critical perspectives argue that Peter's reforms were largely superficial, creating a divided society, a small Europeanized elite and a vast, unaffected peasant majority. The elite adopted European clothing, language, and customs, but these were often superficial imitations rather than a profound cultural shift. Beneath the surface, many nobles retained traditional Russian attitudes, distrust of Europeans, deep attachment to orthodoxy, and a preference for autocratic authority over the rule of law. More importantly, Peter's reforms completely bypassed the peasants, the serfs who made up 85 to 90% of the population. Their lives did not improve during Peter's reign. In fact, they often worsened due to increased taxes and labor demands, such as the construction of St. Petersburg. Peasants continued to live as their ancestors had, in wooden huts, wearing traditional clothing, and speaking Russian without foreign vocabulary. They had never seen St. Petersburg, never encountered foreigners, and had never heard of Peter's reforms except as heavier taxes and forced labor. From this perspective, Peter created 2 Russias, a small, Europeanized, urban elite Russia and a large, traditional, rural populace Russia. These 2 Russias hardly spoke the same language, literally because the elite spoke French, and metaphorically because their worldviews and values were so different. This division would trouble Russia for centuries, ultimately erupting in the 1917 revolution. The truth likely lies somewhere in between. Peter's reforms did create real and lasting changes, particularly among the elite and in urban centers. Russia became more westernized, more European, and more open to external influences. But these changes were limited, geographically confined to cities, socially restricted to the upper classes, and often superficial psychologically. Most of Russia remained relatively unchanged. More importantly, Peter's methods of reform, coercive, violent, and top-down. Meaning, they were often met with resentment and passive resistance, rather than enthusiastic acceptance. People learned to comply outwardly, wearing the right clothes, attending mandatory gatherings, sending their sons to the right schools, while maintaining inner reservations. This created an enduring pattern in Russian political culture: surface compliance but private discontent, public obedience but secret resistance. This pattern was not conducive to fostering a spontaneous, self-sustaining culture of modernization. After Peter's death, some reforms continued, particularly those with clear practical benefits, such as military organization or administrative structures. But other reforms were abandoned or weakened. Some of his successors, notably his daughter Elizabeth and Catherine the Great, continued his westernizing policies. Others were more conservative, allowing some traditional practices to be revived. Yet regardless of specific policies, the fundamental direction Peter established, Russia as a European power oriented toward the West rather than the East, remained unchanged. The ultimate legacy of Peter's Cultural Revolution is paradoxical. It did transform Russia, making it more European, more modern, and more open. But it also created deep social divisions, left a legacy of resentment, and established patterns of cultural coercion that would persist for centuries. Peter's cultural reforms, like his political ones, reveal the central paradox of his approach. He wanted to create a modern, rational European Russia, but he used the most autocratic, irrational, and un-European means to achieve it. He wanted free-thinking, educated citizens, but he created them through coercion and fear. He wanted spontaneous acceptance of European culture, but he enforced it through laws and punishments. These contradictions were not merely philosophical. They shaped the actual trajectory of Russia's modernization, creating patterns and problems that would endure to the present day. Understanding Peter's Cultural Revolution is essential to understanding how Russia became what it is. A country caught between West and East, between modernity and tradition, between Europe and Asia. By the early 1720s, Peter had ruled Russia for over 4 decades, nominally since 1682 and effectively since 1689. He was now in his early 50s but appeared older, marked by decades of relentless work, the pressures of war, personal tragedies, and physical ailments. His health was steadily declining. He suffered from painful bladder and kidney issues, likely due to urethral stricture or kidney stones, which caused frequent and intense pain, fevers, and blood in his urine. These symptoms grew more severe and frequent in 1724. Contemporary doctors, with their limited understanding of urinary diseases, attempted various treatments, including catheterization, herbal remedies, and bloodletting. But none provided lasting relief. Peter continued to work, despite his suffering, inspecting projects, issuing orders, and attending meetings. Yet, his energy was visibly waning, and his body was failing. In November 1724, an event occurred that accelerated Peter's decline. While inspecting naval facilities near the Gulf of Finland, Peter saw a ship run aground in shallow water, with its crew in danger, disregarding his age and health. Peter jumped into the icy water up to his waist to help rescue the crew. He stood in the cold water for hours, assisting in pushing the ship back into deeper water. This exposure, a man already ill in the November waters of the Baltic Sea, triggered a severe fever and worsened his urinary symptoms. Peter never fully recovered. He returned to Petersburg and remained bedridden for weeks. Doctors attempted to treat him, but his condition continued to deteriorate. By early January 1725, it was clear that Peter was dying. He endured intense pain, could barely urinate, and the infection spread to his kidneys and bloodstream. He drifted between consciousness and delirium. As Peter neared death, a pressing question dominated the court. Who would succeed? Peter had never formally named an heir. He had killed his son Alexei in 1718. His sons with his second wife Catherine had died in infancy. He had 2 living daughters, Anna and Elizabeth. But under traditional Russian law, women were excluded from succession. There was also Peter's grandson, Alexei's son, also named Peter, who had a legitimate bloodline claim, but was only 9 years old, representing the candidate the anti-reform faction would support. Peter's wife, Catherine, was another possibility. He had crowned her empress in 1724, hinting she might succeed, but a female ruler was unprecedented in Russian history. Peter's reformers, especially those who had benefited from his policies, were desperate to ensure the succession protected their interests. They supported Catherine, not because of her abilities, she was barely educated and had little interest in governance, but because of her dependence on them. She would need their support, and would thus continue Peter's policies. The conservative faction supported the young Peter, later Peter II, hoping through him they could reverse some of the reforms. Traditionally, Russian succession followed primogeniture. The throne passed to the eldest son, or in the absence of a son, to the male line. But Peter issued a new succession law in 1722, granting the ruling Tsar the right to designate any heir, disregarding traditional rules. This was typical of Peter breaking tradition, centralizing power, and reshaping institutions according to his own will. Yet before his death, he failed to name an heir, according to some accounts. In his final days, Peter attempted to write down the name of his successor. He was given a pen and paper and began to write, but could only manage leave everything to. Before his hand grew too weak and the pen slipped from his fingers. He could no longer write or speak clearly. Peter passed away in the early hours of the 28th of January, 1725, at the age of 52, without clearly designating an heir, plunging Russia into a potential succession crisis. Within hours of his death, the faction supporting Catherine, led by Alexander Menshikov, one of Peter's closest companions, took decisive action. They brought the Guards regiments, the Preobrazhensky and Semyonovsky, loyal to Peter's memory and beneficiaries of his reforms, to the outskirts of the Winter Palace. This was a display of force, or the threat thereof. As the council of nobles gathered to discuss the succession, they could hear the drums and marching of soldiers outside. Menshikov presented the council with a choice: accept Catherine as empress or face a military coup. The committee had no choice but to agree. Catherine I was declared Empress of the Russian Empire, becoming the first female ruler in Russian history. This set a precedent allowing later female rulers, Anna, Elizabeth, Catherine the Great, to dominate Russian politics in the 18th century. However, the immediate consequences were less significant. Catherine ruled for only 2 years, passing away in 1727, and leaving the throne to the young Peter II. He died of smallpox in 1730 at the age of 14. What followed was a series of palace coups, brief reigns, and struggles over succession. A period of instability directly caused by Peter's failure to resolve the issue of inheritance. This instability would persist until Catherine the Great consolidated power in 1762. Peter's death immediately sparked debates over his legacy, which continue to this day. His achievements are undeniable and immense. He transformed Russia from a relatively weak and isolated kingdom into a recognized European power. He established Russia's first truly modern army and navy. He secured a permanent outlet to the Baltic Sea, enabling Russia to engage in European trade and diplomacy. He founded the new capital of St. Petersburg, which would serve as the center of Russian cultural and political life for 2 centuries. He modernized government administration, creating a merit-based system, and secularizing education. He introduced countless technological innovations, from shipbuilding to artillery to printing. He expanded Russia's territory and influence. During his reign, Russia's population grew from about 13 million to about 17 million despite heavy losses from war and forced labor. Russia's international status shifted from a peripheral role to a major one. Russia's opinion now mattered in European diplomacy, its military strength was respected, and its trade was sought after. But the human cost of these achievements was staggering. Historians estimate that, during Peter's 43-year reign, Russia lost about 20–40% of its population. Millions perished in wars, forced labor, famine, disease, and displacement. The exact numbers can never be known. Population records were incomplete, and many deaths went unrecorded. But the scale was immense. The Great Northern War, lasting 21 years, consumed hundreds of thousands of soldiers and civilians. The construction of St. Petersburg likely killed between 30,000 and 100,000 forced laborers. The digging of the Ladoga Canal claimed tens of thousands of lives. Increased taxes and labor demands pushed many peasants to the brink of starvation. Some regions experienced population decline as people fled service or died from illness. This human toll was no accident. It was a direct result of Peter's modernization strategy. He prioritized national objectives over individual well-being, willing to sacrifice hundreds of thousands of lives for what he perceived as the greater good. This raises profound moral questions. When does a ruler have the right to sacrifice people for national goals? When does modernization justify violent means? Can great achievements balance the human suffering required to attain them? There are no simple answers to these questions, and different historians and moral philosophers would offer varying responses. Yet, they are central to any serious assessment of Peter's legacy. Another complex aspect of his rule is the political culture he created, one based on autocratic power, fear, and violence. Peter believed that strong centralized authority was necessary for modernization, and he systematically eliminated any potential checks on his power. The Orthodox Church, the Boyar Council, traditional noble privileges, and local autonomy. He created what may have been one of the most autocratic governments in European history, where the will of the Tsar was absolute, dissent was treason, and opposition was unthinkable. This political model would define Russia for centuries. Peter's successors would inherit and expand this autocratic tradition, making it more institutionalized, systematic, and enduring. Russia would develop a complex machinery of secret police, censorship, and political control systems, all traceable to the precedents established by Peter. Peter demonstrated that modernization and autocracy were not only compatible, but could reinforce each other. This created a lasting pattern where reforms were imposed from above, driven by unrestrained central power without popular participation or consent. This pattern would be repeated in an even more extreme form during the Soviet era, another period of radical modernization driven by an autocratic regime at immense human cost. Peter also created a lasting social division, the split of two Russias. That continues to define Russia to this day. His reforms primarily affected the elites and cities, leaving the vast rural peasant population largely untouched. This created a profound cultural and psychological chasm between the ruling class and the masses, between Europeanized cities and traditional villages, between French-speaking nobles and Russian-speaking peasants. This division was not merely economic, it was existential. The elites and the masses lived in different worlds, with different languages, values, loyalties, and cultural references. They scarcely understood each other. This alienation would create enduring tensions throughout Russian history, between nobles and peasants, urban and rural areas, westernizers and Slavophiles, reformers and reactionaries. It would lead to periodic outbreaks of violence, peasant uprisings, terrorism, and ultimately the 1917 revolution that would overthrow the entire imperial system. From this perspective, Peter's reforms not only modernized Russia but also sowed the seeds of its eventual collapse. Peter's international legacy is equally complex. He successfully made Russia a European power. but he also created lasting European fear and distrust of Russia. Russia was now a vast empire capable of projecting military power across Europe. It could intervene in Poland, the Baltic states, and the Balkans. This power made Russia significant in diplomacy, but it also rendered it a threat. For the next 2 centuries, European policy would largely be driven by the Russian question: how to contain Russian power, how to balance Russian influence, and how to respond to Russian expansionism. The Russian Empire created by Peter would continue to expand in the 18th and 19th centuries, southward into Crimea and the Caucasus. To the east, it entered Central Asia. To the west, it reached Poland. At its peak, it would become the world's largest contiguous land empire, spanning 11 time zones. This expansion would create new challenges, governing a vast multi-ethnic empire, dealing with nationalist movements, and balancing central control with local autonomy. Peter's empire building laid the groundwork for these future challenges. However, Peter also left a legacy with positive aspects. His emphasis on education and science would lead to a flourishing of intellectual life in Russia during the 18th century. The institutions Peter established, the Academy of Sciences, the Naval Academy, and technical schools, would train generations of Russian scientists, engineers, and scholars. By the end of the 18th century, Russia would produce world-class scientists like Lomonosov, world-class writers like Pushkin, and world-class composers like Tchaikovsky. This cultural flourishing was directly attributed to the educational and cultural infrastructure Peter built. The St. Petersburg, founded by Peter, would become one of Europe's most beautiful cities, a center of architecture, art, and literature, a magnet for talent and creativity. This city, despite its bloody origins, would become one of Russia's great contributions to world civilization, a symbol that, though at tragic cost, Russia could create something to match any European culture. Peter's military and administrative reforms also created enduring institutions. The Russian army, though undergoing many reorganizations and reforms, maintained the basic structure Peter established until 1917. The Russian bureaucracy, often criticized for its inefficiency and corruption, retained elements of the hierarchical organization and merit principles Peter introduced. St. Petersburg itself, as the capital, would be the center of Russian political and cultural life until 1918. Peter's personality, his energy, his pragmatism, his practical approach, his willingness to learn, also became a kind of ideal, a model for later Russian reformers attempting to modernize the country. Even during the Soviet era, when Peter's title of Tsar made him ideologically suspect, he was still partially respected as a strongman who pushed Russia forward. Stalin explicitly compared himself to Peter, another powerful modernizer willing to use brutal means for state goals. This comparison reveals the dark side of Peter's legacy. His example could be used to justify authoritarian modernization, to justify sacrificing individuals for the sake of state interests. The ultimate assessment of Peter's legacy may have to be contradictory. He was an extraordinary ruler, visionary, energetic, effective, who truly changed his country. He transformed a backward, isolated kingdom into a major European power. He introduced modernizing innovations, transformed cultural attitudes, and created enduring institutions. Yet, he was also an autocratic tyrant, cruel, violent, and willing to sacrifice countless lives, who caused immense human suffering. He created social divisions, political patterns, and cultural tensions that would haunt Russia for centuries. The system he built fostered both progress and ensured oppression. Understanding Peter requires holding these contradictions together: greatness and terror, achievement and cost, modernization and autocracy. He cannot be reduced to a hero or a villain. He was both, and his legacy continues to shape Russia to this day. Historians continue to debate counterfactuals. What if Peter had never ruled? Would Russia have modernized on its own, more gradually? and with less violence, or would it have remained isolated, eventually conquered by stronger neighbors? These questions have no definitive answers. However, they are crucial for understanding the significance of Peter. Some historians argue that Russia indeed needed drastic reforms to survive in the competitive environment of early modern Europe. Without a modernized military and administration, it would have been dismembered like the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, or entered a long-term decline, like the Ottoman Empire from this perspective. Peter's violence, though terrifying, was necessary for Russia's survival. Other historians believe that Peter's specific methods of modernization were not inevitable. Other countries, such as Prussia or Japan, managed to modernize with less social disruption and human cost. Peter could have chosen a more gradual approach, a more consultative method, one that showed greater respect for human life and traditional culture. His violence was a product of his character and choices, not historical inevitability. From this angle, Peter bears moral responsibility for the suffering he caused. The truth may lie somewhere in the middle. Some degree of modernization might have been necessary for Russia's survival, but the extremity, violence, and social destructiveness of Peter's specific methods were not inevitable. Different rulers could have achieved similar strategic goals through different approaches and at different costs. But history does not offer such experiments. We have Peter's Russia, not some alternative version, and we must evaluate what actually occurred in the centuries since Peter's death. He has remained a complex and contentious figure in the Russian imagination. To some, he is a national hero, the great emperor, the modernizer who made Russia great. His statues tower in St. Petersburg. His achievements are taught in schools, and his policies are defended as necessary for nation building. To others, he is a tyrant and cultural destroyer, the man who killed his own son, enslaved his people, and alienated Russia from its traditions. In the 19th century, Russian intellectuals debated Peter's legacy between Westernizers and Slavophiles. The former believed he saved Russia from backwardness, while the latter argued he destroyed Russia's true spiritual identity. This debate was never truly resolved and continues in various forms to this day. In Putin's Russia, Peter is once again held up as a model of a strong ruler, unafraid to use force in pursuit of national interests. St. Petersburg, though renamed Leningrad during the Soviet era before reverting to its original name, remains Russia's second largest city and a major cultural center. The city itself, with its beautiful architecture and bloody history, stands as an enduring symbol of Peter's contradictory legacy. It represents what is possible, what human will and creativity can achieve, but also the cost, how many human lives were sacrificed for such achievements. Finally, the story of Peter the Great is one about the challenges of modernization, how a society transforms itself, adapts to new realities, and competes with more advanced neighbors. These challenges are not unique to Russia or confined to history. They continue to confront nations around the world today. Peter's example, both inspiring and cautionary, reminds us that modernization is not merely a technical process, but a profound political, social, and moral challenge. It raises difficult questions about the price of progress, the balance between tradition and innovation, the relationship between means and ends, and the responsibility of leaders to their people. Peter's life and legacy do not offer simple answers, but they compel us to confront these questions and reflect on them seriously. That is his ultimate legacy, not as a definitive hero or villain, but as a complex, flawed, and extraordinary human being whose choices continue to resonate and whose legacy continues to shape our world. His story reminds us that history is made by individuals, and that those individuals, with their vision and blind spots, their strengths and weaknesses, can truly alter the course of the world, for better and for worse.